안녕하십니까. 한국의 SDG4 이행과 교육 회복 국제 포럼 그 둘째 날입니다. 저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 TBS 아나운서 강지연입니다. 반갑습니다. 코로나19로 인해 전 세계적으로 교육 격차에 대한 우려가 커지는 가운데 교육 ODA, 즉 교육 개발 협력의 중요성이 더욱 관심을 받고 있습니다. 한 달 전인 11월 10일에 열렸던 세계 교육회의 고위급 회의에서는 공적 개발 원조, 즉 ODA에 국민 총소득의 0.7%를 할당하고 또 교육 ODA의 비중 증가를 촉구하는 내용의 파리 선언이 채택되기도 했는데요. 오늘 포럼은 코로나19 이후 한국의 교육 개발 협력과 SDG4를 주제로 국내외 교육 ODA의 동향과 성과 그리고 미래 교육 과제에 대해 여러분과 함께 논의하고자 합니다. 온라인으로 참가해 주시는 여러분께 감사의 마음을 담아서 오늘도 생중계 이벤트를 준비했습니다. 유튜브 댓글창 상단에 있는 링크에 질문이나 응원 메시지를 남겨주시는 분들 중에서 저희가 추첨을 통해 상품을 보내드립니다. 오늘도 많은 참여 부탁드립니다. 자, 그럼 지금부터 세션 B를 시작하겠습니다. 국제사회의 교육 회복 노력과 과제를 주제로 한 이번 세션은 최재은 가천대학교 행정학과 교수님께서 진행을 맡아주실 텐데요. 최재은 교수님은 교육부 평생교육진흥위원이자 유네스코 한국위원회 교육분과위원 또 국가평생교육진흥원의 자문위원을 역임하고 계십니다. 자, 그럼 교수님 진행 부탁드리겠습니다.
예, 감사합니다. 안녕하세요. 세션 B 국제사회 교육 회복
This is session B,
자장을 맡은
Global Efforts for
가천대학교
Educational
행정학과
Recovery during and after
최재은
COVID-19. As introduced, I am Jae-Eun.
이번
I'm a professor at
세션에서는
Gachon
교육
University.
회복을 위한
In this
국제사회의
session, we will
동향과
look at
앞으로
the
한국 교육
trends
ODA가
and
나아갈
movements of the
방향에 대해서
international
논의를 해보고자
community
합니다.
regarding educational
회의에서
recovery, and we will
참여해 주시는 세
take a
분의
look at the
발표를
way forward
듣고
for Korea
세 분의
and the international
토론자가
community.
토론
We
및
have three presenters and
질의응답하는
three
방식으로
discussants,
진행을 하겠습니다.
and
회의
then we will
발표자분들은
hold
영상으로
a
발표가
Q&A
진행되어
session.
실시간
The
질의응답이
overseas
어려울 수 있는
presenters
점
have sent
여러분께서
videos,
양해를
so we ask for your
부탁드립니다.
understanding that real-time
첫
Q&A may
순서는
not be
OECD
possible.
개발협력부
The first
및
presenter
교육기술부
is Mr.
수석
Michael Ward,
정책
Senior Policy
분석가이자
Analyst
전 피사D
at
프로젝트 실장님이신
OECD.
마이클
He is also a
워드님께서
former manager
교육을
of
위한
PISA
공적
D.
개발 원조를
He will be
주제로
giving a
발표를
presentation on
해주시겠습니다. 어떻게
ODA for
준비되셨을까요?
education. Is the video ready?
Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Ward. I work for the OECD, and I'm very grateful to the organizers of this event for the opportunity to make this presentation on official development assistance to education as part of global efforts for education recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me start by defining official development assistance, or ODA as it's better known. ODA is defined by the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, since 1969 as government or government agency aid that is concessional. So that means that it's grants and soft loans. And this ODA is administered with the promotion of the economic development and welfare of developing countries as the main objective. ODA to education includes grants, scholarships, and soft loans. So what has been the impacts of COVID-19 on ODA for education? Well, the short answer is we don't know, not yet. We don't know yet for sure. Data collection for ODA is about a year behind time. So the data collected in 2021 on ODA is on calendar year 2020. We won't have detailed data until the end of December 2021. But we already know that several efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And we already know overall ODA levels increased in 2020. In addition, the SDG4 Global Education Cooperation Mechanism and other global programs such as the Global Partnership for Education, GP, are putting financing domestic resources as well as ODA at the top of the education policy agenda. So the good news is that ODA from members of the OECD's DAC rose to an all-time high of US dollars 161.2 billion in 2020, which is up 3.5% in real terms from 2019. And this is boosted by additional spending mobilized to help developing countries grappling with the COVID-19 crisis. Also, and I think very importantly, bilateral ODA to Africa and least developed countries rose by 4.1% and 1.8% respectively. So as I said, the details for 2020 ODA, we don't know yet. And we don't know yet the share of ODA to education. That will be confirmed, as I said, by the end of December. But when we look at the trends for ODA to education over the last 10 years, I think we can take some encouragement. When we look at these trends, we can see that ODA to education had nearly tripled in the last 17 years. Both bilateral ODA, which is delivered directly by donor countries to recipient countries, the largest bilaterals being the US and the UK over the last 10 years, and multilateral ODA, which is dispersed by the bilateral donors through the multilateral organizations such as the World Bank. We can see that in both cases, bilateral ODA and multilateral ODA, there has been increased. And as I say, to the extent it's almost tripled in the last 17 years. This steady growth to ODA to education reached a peak in 2019 with an amount of US dollars 15.9 billion ODA to education, which is an all-time high in the history of ODA to education. It's also important to note that ODA to education has been stable in terms of its distribution over these last 10 or so years. The shares of bilateral and multilateral ODA to education have remained constant since 2010 at around 75 to 25% respectively, bilateral, multilateral ODA. I think it's also important to note that ODA to education broken down by subsectors has also remained fairly constant over these last 10 years, with about a quarter of the total going to education policy, training and research, and just under a third going to basic education, and around 10% going to secondary education, with a little over 1/3 allocated to post-secondary education. So a fairly stable breakdown of ODA to education. Where we have seen a change in these trends is the share of aid to education in total ODA. So here we can see a steep decline from 2010, with something of a recovery in the last 3 years or so. But we end the decade with education share of ODA at 7.4%, less than it was at the beginning. Another important aspect to note is that more than half of ODA to education goes to middle income countries. And this has been the trend for the past several years. Another area of aid to education where we have seen significant change in recent years is in private philanthropy for education in developing countries. As you can see here, over recent years, private philanthropic foundations have been significantly stepping up their finance for education, with the MasterCard Foundation and the Lego Foundation, the largest philanthropic donors by really quite a long way. So it is clear that efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions in education caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. At the most recent, the 2021 Global Education meeting held on the 10th of November here in Paris, several heads of state and more than 40 ministers of education agreed the Paris Declaration, which included this commitment on aid. So repeating the long-standing commitment to reach the benchmark of ODA 0.7% of donor GNI for ODA, increasing the share of ODA to education as a percentage of total ODA. So as we've seen, it's currently 7.4%, and ensuring that the international aid to education is aligned with national education plans and consistent with aid effectiveness principles. So there's obviously still some way to go to meet these commitments. The ODA GNI is currently 0.35%, so only half of the commitment to 0.7. But it is a re-energizing, I think, we've seen this year of the international community to increase support for education. And just to highlight some of these international efforts, the World Bank, which is the biggest provider of external finance to education, in the fiscal year 2020, the World Bank provided about $5.2 billion in loans for educational programs, technical assistance, and other projects designed to improve learning. Another highlight is the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, another significant provider of support for education. GPE dispersed US dollars 818 million in grants in 2020. And through its replenishment campaign, which has reached its sort of climax in 2021, the GPE is seeking to raise 5 billion US dollars to implement its financing and funding framework from 2021 to 2025. 4 billion US dollars has been raised so far by GPE, and GPE says this will allow them to help up to 175 million children to learn and get 88 million more girls and boys into school by 2025. Despite, we must accept, I think, the possibility of a worst case scenario in which, while overall ODA levels are maintained at the 2020 level, the share of this that goes to education reduces below the 2019 level of 7.4%, as aid to health, social welfare, and other sectors are given higher priority by donors. So, case scenario, and it is possible. But given the trends that we've seen in aid to education over these last 10 years, I think perhaps we can expect a better case scenario. This is one in which ODA to education is at least maintained at 2019 levels of 15.9 billion US dollars, and then continues upward, the trend of the last 17 years. But I would add that in this better case scenario, there should be more priority given to basic education in low-income countries to help them recover from the pandemic and to get on track for SDG4 achievement by 2030. So 2 possible scenarios, and we will very soon know which scenario is our reality as far as 2020 is concerned. So thank you very much for your attention. And again, thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation. If you would like more information about ODA to education, please feel free to email me at the address you can see here, michael.ward@oecd.org. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 예, 마이클 워드님의 발표
very
아마
much,
모두 다 잘
Mr. Michael
들으셨을 것
Ward.
같아요.
I hope you
글로벌 교육
enjoyed his
ODA의 전반적인
presentation.
동향과
He
함께
gave us
앞으로의
the
어떤 예측
overall status
시나리오를
of the
설명해
global ODA,
주셨는데
particularly in the
정말로
field of
이제
education,
어떤
as
보건이나
well as
사회복지에
future
대한 어떤
forecast.
그 이제 지원이 늘으면서
With the
교육에 대한
increase
지원이
in
줄어든다면
aid
이제 큰일
in the
나겠죠.
sector
그
of health and the social
시나리오는
services,
성사되지 않기를 바랍니다.
there is a
예,
possibility
좋습니다.
that the
이제 두
education
번째
ODA will
저희가
be
이
decreased.
발표를
I
들어야
think it would not
듣는 이제
happen.
시간이 되겠는데요.
In the future,
이번에
I
모시는
would like
분은
to invite our
에델
next speaker.
발렌젤라 동남아시아 교육장관
Our next
기구의
speaker is the
사무총장이십니다.
director of the
이
SEAMEO
총장님께서는
Secretariat,
유네스코
Ethel,
평생학습원
Agnes,
자문위원이자
Valenzuela.
아세안 직업기술교육위원회
The
자문위원을
next
역임하고
speaker is also
계십니다.
an advisory board
발표해 주실
member of the
주제는
UNESCO Institute for
코로나19
Lifelong
팬데믹
Learning,
상황에서
as well as the
동남아시아
ASEAN
교육
Tibet
ODA
Council.
신수요입니다.
The presentation
굉장히
is
이제 흥미로운
titled
발표가
Newly
될 것
Rising
같은데요.
Demands in
예, 우리
Southeast Asia in
온라인으로
Respect
예,
of ODA
발표를
for
들어보도록
Education in the
하겠습니다.
Context of COVID-19.
Excellencies, distinguished speakers, esteemed guests, high-level officials, and organizers, to all our participants, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all. It is my honor to present at this very important occasion. Today, I will discuss about Southeast Asian efforts in narrowing digital divide toward educational recovery after COVID-19. First, I would like to introduce you to SEAMEO. The Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization is an intergovernmental organization promoting regional cooperation in education, in science, and culture. We have 11 member countries, 9 associate member countries, and 6 affiliate members. During the pandemic, this had created an impact in our segments of the population, especially affecting the education sector, in which schools have been forced to close, numerous educational programs have resorted to virtual or blended mode. For educators and learners, these were difficult times. This has also magnified the pre-existing inequalities in access to meaningful learning opportunities. The pandemic evidences the gap in necessary devices for connectivity between the better off and the most underserved areas in Southeast Asia. According to the fact sheet by UNESCO Institute for Statistics shared on World Teachers' Day in 2020, over two-thirds of primary schools globally, or 73%, had access to electricity, which is critical to supporting online programs and classes. And in our region, this is 55%. Additionally, access to schools' computer is not universal in the most middle and low-income regions, varying from 96% in Central Asia to 20% in Southeast Asia. Moreover, bigger schools are better equipped with financial, educational, and technological resources than smaller schools. Many schools are facing a severe shortage of basic resources. This leads to the differences in the availability, quality, and quantity of online learning resources for students in urban versus rural, big versus small schools, not to mention a large number of schools categorized as disadvantaged. So remote rural schools and small schools are at disadvantaged situation during the COVID-19 pandemic because oftentimes these are inaccessible and mostly located in underserved areas. Border schools are also disadvantaged because of their location, and some of them have other challenges such as conflict and fewer enrollment. These disadvantaged schools are at the lower end of disparities when it comes to ICT and digitalization. Thus, the pandemic heightened the digital divide that is contributing to disruption of teaching and learning. However, in Southeast Asia, our ministers of education have tried their best to face digital challenges in teaching and learning. SEAMEO member countries have utilized digital learning platforms to ensure learning continuity. Most countries, from Brunei Darussalam to Vietnam, use popular digital tools like Microsoft Tools, G Suites, Zoom meetings to conduct virtual classes, or online self-study, modular instruction, learning resources that are provided in the Ministries of Education website or Facebook pages of Ministries of Education. Educational programs were also provided via TV and radio channels. These are also common alternative learning approaches in Southeast Asian countries. In addition, our member countries have developed their own digital platforms, such as Indonesia with Teacher Shares and Teacher Learns platform, Lao PDR with Lao Learn, Malaysia with the Lima or Digital Learning Initiative Malaysia, Philippines with Dept Commons, to name a few. These are all comprehensive learning platforms for teachers and students to facilitate remote classroom, offering free educational services and application in one platform accessible to all. I would like to inform to you the bigger challenge on learning lost in this region. During the pandemic, we have been hearing a lot of stories, some success stories and some are challenging stories. We have embarked on regional assessment, which we call as Southeast Asia Primary Learning Metrics or CPLM. And the results of CPLM 2019 was shared in 2020 December, depicting the learning outcomes in Southeast Asia. Recently, we did the secondary analysis, the CPLM 2019 latest evidence in basic education, and we have reported low-performing readers in 6 Southeast Asian countries. The Australian Council for Educational Research served as our technical expert in CPLM 2019. We have 2 partner organizations from Korea, the Korean Educational Development Institute and the Korea Institute for Curriculum Evaluation, and that is KAIS. We also have worked with UNESCO, Asia Pacific Regional Bureau for Education, which is NECMAP, and our co-chair for CPLM is UNICEF East Asia Pacific Regional Office. All experts have shared their experiences in addressing the problems of low-performing readers and recommended some actions to track reading policy changes and their impacts on learning outcome. In Southeast Asia, we need to boost learning outcomes by improving system and practice changes so that we can reduce the number of low-performing readers over time. SEAMEO has been working with ASEAN Secretariat in Indonesia and the Korean Educational Cooperation Fund to implement the next round of CPLM, or what we call as CPLM 2021 to 2025. And we thank the Korean government for working with us in this regional initiative of improving learning in Southeast Asia. In fiscal year 2020 to 2021, SEAMEO Secretariat launched the COVID-19 Accessible and Responsive Educational Support Program. We envision that learners and teachers, especially those in disadvantaged areas, should be equipped and empowered to use technology and other alternative modalities during school disruptions. There is no one-size-fits-all in Southeast Asia due to the wide differences in context, operational realities, and infrastructure among 11 countries. Thus, we have developed in a positive lens COVID-19 programs to address disruptions, severely tested the resilience and adaptability of schools teachers and those teachers who have emerged stronger by pivoting the extended home-based learning, acquiring digital skills, and delivering effective remote learning. SEAMEO, together with its 26 centers and network, and the member countries, associate members, and affiliate, are working now towards ensuring the digitalization of education, making it inclusive and meaningful to leave no one behind. Moreover, during the 51st SEAMEO Council Conference in June 2021 and the 5th Strategic Dialogue for Education Ministers, they have embraced the theme New Education Imperatives in a Post-COVID Era and called to action member countries, associate member countries, and affiliate members to champion education transformation in Southeast Asia through strategic collaboration and partnership. I thank you very much for your attention, and we hope that we can do joint collaborative activities together, capacity building, research, and the like. Wishing you a pleasant discussion. Have a good day, everyone.
예, 에델 발렌젤라 동남아시아 교육 장관기구
Thank you
사무총장님께서
very
발표를
much for
해주셨는데요.
that
저희가
presentation.
그 발표 덕분에 이제
Thanks
저희가
to her
SEAMEO라고 그래서 SEAMEO
presentation,
회원국들이
we were
팬데믹으로 인해서
able
어떠한
to
어려움을 겪고
see
있고
what kind of
그걸 또 극복하기
challenges
위해서
SEAMEO
어떠한 노력을
members
하고
faced and what kind
있는지
of efforts
그리고
they
이제
made to
외부에서
overcome those
주어지는 ODA
challenges.
교육이
And I
어떠한
think
또
we were
역할을 하고
able to
있는지를 잘
see
알 수 있었던 것
how
같습니다.
educational
앞으로 이제
ODA works
SEAMEO와 또
on the
일부
ground.
한국 또 다른
I'm sure
도너
that
이제
SEAMEO
컨트리들이
and
파트너십을
Korea and other
통해서
donor
아까
countries will
이제
forge
설명해 주신
partnerships into
프로그램
the future
CEPLM인데요.
to build further
SEAPLM
CPLM.
프로그램이 더욱 발전해
And I hope
나가기를
that this will
진심으로
contribute to the development
바랍니다.
of
네,
CPLM
이제
further.
저희 세 번째 발표가
Next, I would like to
되겠습니다.
introduce our third
그러면서
speaker.
이제 마지막 발표가 될 텐데요.
It will be the
박종희
last
유엔
presentation
대학교
in the session
학과장님께서 이제
number
발표해 주시겠습니다.
2, or the session B. And the presenter is Professor Park Jong-hee, Head of Innovation and Education of the United Nations University, and also she served as a former program specialist for ICT of UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. She will deliver a presentation under the title of Education ODA in a Time of
Good
Crisis,
afternoon,
a suggestion
everyone.
from
Thank
United
you for
Nations
having me at
University.
the International Education Forum 2021, and special thanks to the Korea National Commission for UNESCO. My name is Jong-Hee Park, and I'm the head of the Innovation and Education Program at United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. I'm not an expert on ODA, but I would like to suggest some areas for education ODA from a UN agency's perspective, especially in a time of multiple crises that we are facing. When many countries were still struggling with the pandemic and its continuous uncertainty, there was a wake-up call from the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, or IPCC, through its sixth assessment report in August 2021. The main message in a very, very simplified term is that no matter what we do, and even if we stop CO2 emission completely today, the 1.5 Celsius warming is no longer avoidable until 2040. In fact, what we are currently witnessing globally is the impact at 1.1 Celsius degree warming. In Tuvalu, the sea level rise is affecting the people every day, and the entire nation is expected to be submerged by the end of the century, and there are at least 15 more island countries in the Pacific facing the same risk. You may have seen this famous media coverage at COP26 a few weeks ago by the Tuvalu Minister of Foreign Affairs making a speech pledging to the world in the knee-deep in the ocean. So each government of these island countries are really working hard to find a way to relocate the people in a safe and effective way. If the sea level rise is a slow onset of climate impact and triggers the government or planned relocation, floods like this requires a government an immediate disaster response for displaced people with shelters and makeshift schools. And the number of floods like this in for example, Indonesia and in many other countries, but Indonesia, for example, has increased from 100 floods a year between 1970 and 2000 to 1,500 floods a year in 2020. In fact, the number of displaced people due to the climate impact is skyrocketing. I just exemplify here three of the most disaster-prone countries with a large population in Asia, namely Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the Philippines. You can see from 2010 to 2015 to 2020, for just last 10 years, the number of displaced people due to the climate change are six-folds in Bangladesh in blue line and the Philippines in the yellow line the same. And a report says as many as 62 million people in South Asia only could be displaced by 2050, which is larger than the entire population of South Korea. So this is the main focus of my short talk today. How can education ODA help learning continuity and ensure right to education in a time of multiple and predicted crises like climate change, based on a current research that the UN University is currently undertaking. This regional study is a joint project between UNESCO and UN University, and is to identify policy and institutional barriers and also their readiness for ensuring climate displaced persons' right to education and also their right to their lifelong learning. Actually, we are in the middle of the research, but I would like to share some preliminary findings and subsequent suggestions for timely recovery and international aid. One of the preliminary findings is that there are indeed many different scenarios regarding climate impacts, and each scenario requires different responses and measures to ensure the right to education of the displaced people. For example, what will be the best way for international aid to provide a timely support to students who just lost their schools? Certainly, 1 month of processing the transaction might not be the best way, as you can see from this interview with the student who were frustrated because they couldn't go back to school for 2 months after the disaster. Second, how can we assist a government who is planning a massive relocation of their people? The physical accommodation like lands and housing is one thing, but protecting their native cultural identity that usually tied up with their land is certainly another. And what about children who left behind because a fisher father had to work in an urban area to earn their living because their river doesn't have fish anymore due to the climate change? What about people who had to cross the border and need to learn different languages and new skills to make their new life there due to the climate change? And what about people who decided to stay put or forced to stay and decided to cope with the risks because of the lack of resources or other reasons? All these scenarios need different strategies, and different international aids have a lot to do depending on the strength and the interest of the respective donor countries. So apart from these distinctive scenarios, I'm also pleased to share some other preliminary findings. First, data on displaced persons and whether they went back to their home or permanently moved out of affected area and why they decided to do so are extremely rare. For example, UNHCR says 80% of the refugees left their home not because of political conflict or violence, but because of acute food insecurity. If this is a case for cross-border refugees, you can imagine how hard it would be to trace the reasons why and how long these internally displaced persons due to the climate change or out of their home since the climate disaster. And it is really, really hard to construct effective measures if we don't know this data to begin with. Second, international and national responses alike tend to prioritize younger children and unintentionally leave out adolescents. This may cause serious issues because many research show that when secondary students are out of school for too long, they ended up getting married off or involved with crimes or not coming back to school because of many other reasons when the school reopened. This was actually evident in many research on the issues under the COVID-19 school closure by many organizations. Third, people tend to stay put in their home and leave the moving as a last resort when for the time that they really, really cannot stand the climate impact anymore. So there are needs for disaster risk reduction and resilience education program for those who decide to stay or those who are trapped. Fourth, remote learning can help ensure learning continuity of students. And as many research again in COVID-19 situation shows. But we have to remember, especially a high-tech country like Korea, when we try to assist countries with remote learning, we really have to be careful with what could work in a disaster situation where usually electricity is cut off or not stable for a long time. So some low-tech or no-tech even options should be considered. Finally, climate change cannot be mitigated without general public's active participation, awareness, and sustainable action. Therefore, climate change education is a key for mitigation and adaptation, and international aid can help integrate this into national curriculum for formal education, as well as general public awareness through non-formal education like community learning centers for developing and developed countries alike. When it comes to climate education, I would like to make an emphasis on making this climate education more action-oriented and that triggers behavioral changes. From this chart from UNESCO's report in 2019, you can see how much our climate change curriculum are still focused on rote learning type of knowledge base learning all across primary, secondary, and tertiary education, and how little we do in terms of behavior change, which shows in gray in the chart. This gives us a message that we need to rethink our climate change curriculum to influence and change behaviors beyond the knowledge level of climate change. I would like to close my talk by listing some of the main donors in this area of climate displacement and justice. And many of them, as you can see, are from the Northern European countries. I hope that more donors like Korea heighten their interest in this area and help ensure the climate justice. Here are some references, and I thank you for your listening and attention. Thank you very much.
네, 박정희 학과장님께서
Thank you very much, Ms. Park Jong-hee. Your presentation was quite interesting. Korea has come up with a target of carbon neutrality by 2050. And also there is increasing attention to and interest in the climate change and the climate justice. And it has been a great opportunity for us to think about the meaning of climate justice. Thank you, Professor Park. This concludes the presentations for session B, and we have 3 discussants joining us here.
Allow me to first introduce our discussants before we hear their comments. To my right is Mr. Park Dong-sun, who is the lead shepherd of the Institute of APEC Collaborative Education. And he is also a professor at the Department of Employment Service Policy of the Korea University of Technology and Education. The next discussant is Professor Jae-Eun of the Korea University of Technology and Education. He is also a senior researcher for education and training policy at KWAK, and he also served as researcher for industrial human resource policies at KIET. Our last discussant is Ms. Kyung-suk, who is a chief of the Division of External Relations at the Korea Institute for Curriculum and Evaluation, and she has also conducted research on curriculum and global educational development, and she was a former researcher at OECD and other international organizations. So now let me first invite Park Dong-sun for his comments. He may speak about the presentations and also share his opinion about the broader theme of the forum, the implementation of SDG4, as well as educational recovery.
For the past 5 years, I I have served as lead shepherd of APEC Human Resources Development Working Group, dealing with education, training, and labor issues. In that position, I have witnessed 21 APEC member economies' various efforts to provide quality education to their students under the threat of COVID-19 pandemic. Because of the pandemic, students are suffering from interrupted learning, unequal access to digital learning portals, and other learning opportunities. This situation is worse in developing economies than in developed ones. Therefore, ODA and other assistance to developing countries is getting all the more important in our global efforts for educational recovery. In this connection, it was very timely and fortunate for us to hear enlightening presentation about ODA for education by Mr. Michael Ward, OECD Senior Policy Analyst. According to him, overall ODA level increased in 2020, but the share of aid to education in total ODA decreased below 2019 level of 7.4%. This is because donors give priority to health, social welfare, and other sectors. Fortunately, various efforts are being made by the international community to tackle the disruptions caused by the pandemic. For example, Paris Declaration issued by the 2021 Global Education Meeting calls for the increase of the volume, predictability, and effectiveness of international aid to education. Specifically, the Paris Declaration urges that donor countries, A, meet the benchmark of 0.7% of donor GNI for ODA to developing countries, and B, increase the share of ODA to education as a percentage of total ODA. According to Mr. Ward, the World Bank is the biggest provider of external finance to education, amounting to $5.2 billion in 2020. In addition, private philanthropic foundations such as MasterCard, Lego, and others have significantly increased their finance to education. I support Mr. Ward's suggestion, therefore, that more priority should be given to basic education in low-income countries to help them recover from the pandemic and get back on track for SDG4 achievement by 2030. To ensure this achievement, I believe that a more effective monitoring and performance evaluation is required. Secondly, in her very illuminating presentation, Director of the SEAMEO, Madame Ethel Valenzuela, illustrates how different SEAMEO member countries utilize different digital platforms depending on their respective needs for ICT education caused by the pandemic. And I believe that the Southeast Asia Primary Learning Matrix, or CPLM project, assesses learning outcomes of grade 5 students to inform basic education policy and ensure all children achieve meaningful learning. The project will be a very helpful example for other countries. And if SEAMEO successfully implements the initiative of capacity building of teachers in close cooperation with UNICEF and the Korean Education Ministry's LEAD project, a mutually beneficial outcome will be achieved. LEAD stands for Learning Educators for Achieving E-Learning Development, and LEAD is a global teachers community engaged in the globalization of e-learning initiative. Thirdly, Dr. Park Jong-hee from the UN University raises the issue of ODA in a time of crisis caused by climate change. Dr. Park is warning that even if we stop CO2 emission completely today, the 1.5 degree Celsius warning is no longer avoidable until 2040. Because of this global warming, Tuvalu and other 50 more island countries in the Pacific will be submerged underwater by the end of the century. People need to be relocated for shelters and makeshift schools in a timely manner. Under these extreme circumstances, a remote learning can help ensure learning continuity for the students. And I agree with Dr. Park that climate change education is of key importance. To achieve an effective remote learning, I believe that teachers from different economies may conduct joint research and or develop new curricula. Thank you very much.
예, 감사합니다. 우리 박정선 원장님께서는 이 세 분의
Thank you very much, Director Park Jong-sun. You made a very thorough comments on the presentations made by the three presenters.
발표와 관련해서 이제 이런
With regard to the last presentation of the session, the director mentioned the remote learning or the online learning and the importance of such kind of educational method. So if we have another chance, we'd like to invite him for further information sharing. Now I'd like to invite Professor Jae-Eun for our next discussant.
Okay, thank you very much. As introduced, my name is CHOI. First of all, I feel very honored to take a chance to discuss the topic of how the international community work together to overcome the negative impact of COVID-19 on education. In particular, since I've been mainly involved in vocational education and training policies, I would like to comment on the issues, very practical issues related to vocational education and training. Also, it has already been widely mentioned, even through this conference, about the negative impact on overall education. Such negative impact seems to have been greater in vocational education, which requires learning not only on theory but also actual hands-on skills. Korea seems to be no exception. In other words, also Korea's physical digital infrastructure itself is better than other countries. There was several difficulties in responding to the corona pandemic by using digital technology for vocational education. In fact, the Ministry of Education of Korea has already been actively considering the use of digital technology in education since more than 10 years ago. For example, the Smart Education Promotion Strategy announced in 2011 already emphasized the need for effective use of ICT in school education. Also, as for vocational education, the policy of activation of distance learning has been promoted. And on top of them, especially, the government has also tried to respond to corona pandemic by promoting the development and use of online courseware in vocational education. For instance, a special website was created last year by the government. The name of the website is Remote Class Data Sharing Community. Through this community, vocational high school teachers are creating their own online learning materials for vocational high school subjects and share them with other teachers. The reason of the background of this community was that vocational subjects are very diverse and much more difficult to transform into online courseware. So instead of relying on government alone, many field experts like school teachers have to be widely mobilized. Considering the fact that TVET, technological and vocational education training, is an essential part of the whole education system, it seems also very important for the international community to collect these diverse experiences, examine their effects, and share them with any countries interested in. Of course, the Korean experiences were not completely satisfactory. Many people point out that the opportunities to acquire practical skills have decreased due to the corona pandemic, and also others point out that safe and meaningful field training is not being conducted during the pandemic period. So clearly it is necessary to critically review the experiences of Korea as well. Anyway, by going through such a reflective evaluation and also examining how to apply or adapt these experiences to students and schools with limited access to electricity and restricted ICT infrastructure, we would be able to explore a new model of vocational education in the future beyond just an inevitable response to the corona pandemic. My comments end here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
네, 최영석 교수님 감사합니다. 이제 팬데믹으로 인해서
Thank you very much, Professor Chae. You talked about how COVID-19 has impacted all sectors of environment, of education, but as you mentioned earlier, it has particularly impacted the TVET sector hard because TVET is all about hands-on learning. And in Korea, in order to overcome these challenges, there were many efforts that have been made that were outlined by Professor Choi. Now I would like to invite our last discussant for her comments. The last discussant is Jang Kyung-suk.
Thank you for inviting me to the discussion on the great presentation by Mike Ward and Ethel, Agnes, Valenzuela, and Jongwi Park. And due to the time constraint, I try to keep my discussion short, concise, and succinct. The three presentations commonly seem to share the view that on one side of the COVID-19 pandemic as a crisis has had devastating effect on education across the world. And on the other hand, there is a hope for discovery by taking the pandemic as an opportunity for change. Instead of highlighting the crisis aspect, I'd like to draw our attention to how the crisis can be opportunity for discovery and even growth with a focus on three aspects. First, after the outbreak of the pandemic, one of the key issues in education was digital connectivity in countries where infrastructure was poorly built. Here we may raise a question: what have the ODA to education done to improve infrastructure in such developing countries? And for digital economy, and fourth, industrial revolution age, and even the TVET for the future. And grant, scholarship, and soft loans have been mobilized to support. But when the pandemic outbroke, one main problem was diagnosed as digital disconnectivity due to poor infrastructure. The past ODA to education seemed to fail to meet such regional needs. While it is needed to predict the ODA to education at the post-COVID-19 and make efforts to increase it, but also it is very critical and significant to look for the way to improve effectiveness as quality control, not to repeat the same failure to meet the local needs. Secondly, large-scale assessment to measure learning outcome like CPLM in Southeast Asian countries is considered as a very useful tool to diagnose the current status of basic education and build up data-driven educational policy. While we can draw useful implications and insights from all the statistics of such large-scale test results and questionnaires responses by students and teachers and other stakeholders, we need to be careful in adopting the findings in policy and practice. The assessment is sample-based, so here we can raise a question: how representative the participating students are, and how about the data about the children outside the schools, such as refugees or climate change displaced pupils, etc., on which little data exists about them. Another question is how meaningful the statistics are to non-participating students and teachers. I like to suggest that the data from the large-scale assessment needs to be used to get a better and realistic picture on the context with the data from other sources in a complementary manner. Last, but related to the first and the second issues, it is important to sustainability of the intergovernmental and regionalized assessment aligned with the international standards to draw meaningful implications for policy and the practice, as many countries do with PISA, TIMSS, or ICRS. I'd like to close my discussion by suggesting we need mid and long-term strategic plans to work in collaboration with regional and international parties or organizations for ODA to education. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chang Kyung-suk. She focused her comments on student learning, and she talked about the effectiveness of ODA and designing ODA so that it is effective and to reflect the needs of the local communities. Thank you for your comments. With the help of our presenters and discussants, we have some time before the break. We have a question from one of our online participants, Hwang Ji-nu, and Hwang Ji-nu had a question for our second presenter who sent a video because she could not participate in real time. So we cannot offer you a response right now, but your question was that providing quality education is very important, and what kind of measures should take priority to ensure quality education. So it is a very broad question, but I would like to turn the question to Mr. Park Dong-sun, and I would like to ask him what kind of efforts are being made by APEC to enhance the quality of education overall.
Well, I think I already explained what we are doing at the APEC, so maybe let me refer to the Korean government efforts for new Southern policy and its focus on ASEAN and other great developing countries, ODA. Korea, with its new Southern policy, attaches great importance to and priority to its relations with ASEAN and other developing countries. Accordingly, Korea has allocated 10% over ODA budget, that is about 400 billion Korean won for these countries in the fiscal year of 2022. This budget covers multiple areas, including education, health, and transportation. Because of the pandemic, remote learning using ICT is in great demand. Therefore, it is advisable that Korea increase projects to share with these countries its accumulated experiences and knowledge in remote education, as we are doing in our institute vis-a-vis APEC economies. Thank you.
예, 그 아세안 국가 또 이제 APEC 국가들과의 어떤 협력 방안에 대해서 이제 말씀을 해주셨습니다.
He commented on the cooperation between the Korean government and other APEC countries. We are running out of time, so we have to conclude this session. For this past hour, we have had 3 presentations and 3 discussants talk about the global efforts for educational recovery during and after COVID-19. I would like to thank all our participants, our presenters and discussants, and I hope that our discussions contribute to the educational recovery. Thank you.
네, 세션 B는 이렇게
Thank
마무리하겠고요.
you very
다음은
much. This
세션
concludes session
C가
B, and we'll get started with session C right away.
코로나19 극복을 위한 한국
The
교육
session
ODA
C
성과를
is
주제로
going to be
곽재성 경희대학교 국제대학원
proceeded on the theme
교수님께서
of review
좌장을
of South
맡아주셨는데요.
Korean educational
교수님께서는
ODA
아셈 듀오
in the
장학재단
context of
이사장과
addressing the
외교부 정책
pandemic
자문위원을
crisis.
역임하고 계십니다. 그럼 교수님께 진행 부탁드리겠습니다.
Professor Kwak Jae-Sung will be moderating session C.
네, 교수님 진행 준비되셨으면 부탁드리겠습니다.
Professor, are you ready?
네, 여러분 안녕하세요. 방금
Good
소개받은
afternoon,
곽재성입니다.
ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I
전
am
세션 저도 옆에서
곽재성.
잘 들었는데요.
I
역시
took
한국
part, I
ODA의
listened
교육
in
분야
on
가장
session B.
중요하기도 하고
And I think
중점적으로
educational ODA
나아가는
is very
분야에서 계속
important.
이어받아서
And so I
우리
think we need to
SDGs
continue this
교육
discussion.
회복이라는
So,
이런 대제목 하에
under
그
the
특히나
broader theme
코로나19
of
극복을 위한
SDG4 and
한국 교육
educational
ODA의 성과에 대해서
recovery,
다양한
in
교육
this
ODA
session, we will
관계자들
be
모시고
reviewing South Korean
논의를
educational
해보도록
ODA in the
하겠습니다.
context of addressing the
한국
pandemic
교육개발협력
crisis.
사업이 코로나19로 인해서
Educational
어떻게
development
변화했는지
cooperation
또
in the
변화의
face of
과정과
COVID
그
has
성과는
changed a bit.
무엇인지에 대해서
So we will take a look at
그
the changes
선생님들,
and look at the
다섯 분 선생님들 모시고
achievements
말씀을 나누도록
of
하겠는데요.
educational development
우선
cooperation
한
of
분
Korea.
모셔서 한
I would
10분
like
정도씩
to
말씀을
invite
듣도록
the
하겠습니다.
presenters and give them 10
우선
minutes each
오지나
for their
인제대학교
presentation. The
간호대학
first presenter is
교수님이
Ojina, who is a
발표를
professor at the College of
교수님은
Nursing at Inje
한국
University.
간호교육평가원 평가위원과
And
국제협력 선도대학
She
육성지원사업
is also a member
사업단장
of the
인제대학교
accreditation
간호대학
committee of the Korean
교수를
Accreditation Board of Nursing
오늘
Education, and she is also the
뉴
project manager of
노멀
international
시대의
cooperation in leading
간호사
universities
역량
foster
개선
program.
이런 주제가
Her
되겠습니다.
presentation
발표 시작해 주시죠.
is titled Nurses Competency Improvement in the New Normal Era.
Good afternoon. My name is Jina. I'm a nursing professor and project manager of a leading university project of international cooperation in Inje University. I would like to explain my experience of ODA project, and I explain two importance of the nursing competencies improvement in the new normal era. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic has put global citizens under unprecedented pressure. Actually, the healthcare workforce had been struggling to cope even before pandemic took hold. Especially nurses have critical roles and responsibilities to take care for patients during the pandemic. They will continue to be at front line of COVID-19, and they have to patient care in hospital and actively involved in assessment and monitoring in communities. While all over the world are suffering from COVID-19, however, the developing countries suffer more. So I think we have to go together. I've been focused on the third and the fourth of SDGs. As you know, the third goal is education and well-being, good health and well-being. And the fourth goal is quality educations. Actually, the education of nurses for nurses is very essential to the quality of care. Anyway, I'm working at Inje University. and with 5 hospitals. The Father John lead Ethel is Dr. Schweitzer in Korea. He was a South Korean doctor and Catholic priest. I'm very proud of him because he graduated at Inje Medical College. He emphasized on human being and heal the world with interfaith activity. He was nominated as the person who brought the honor to his alma mater, Inje University. Through the John Lee's spirit, Inje University were performed lots of international cooperation projects. It is my first experience of ODA project. Actually, I performed my project for Sri Lankan nurses. The title was the establishment of a bachelor degree course in the nursing school for enhancement of Sri Lanka health status. The International Development Cooperation Program workshops for nursing leaders of Sri Lanka was held over 20 times during 6 years. The nursing curriculum development and the teaching and learning strategies and evaluation method, etc., were held in the Colombo and Kandy province. The 9 Sri Lankan nursing leaders studied at Inje universities for getting master and doctoral degree. Some of them they returned Sri Lanka and came back their own institutions. However, three of graduation students hired at the new Faculty of Nursing at Colombo University. After 4 years from this Sri Lankan project, the Sri Lankan government decided to build new nursing faculty at Colombo universities. The nursing curriculum for bachelor degree was developed by this project. Finally, January 11th, 2018, inauguration of Faculty of Nursing was held at University of Colombo in Sri Lanka. It was an historical event and evidence of fruit from Korea ODA project. The same year, in 2019, maybe 95 new students entered the Faculty of Nursing, Colombo University. I had lectured for new nursing students about nursing philosophy, and for new faculties about roles about nurse educators, roles of nurse educators. I emphasized that you should become a nurse leaders of Sri Lanka. One more, our outcome was the train for emergency nurses. We developed the emergency training program. Many nurses working at the emergency room were trained with our program. When they finished this program, they could take a diploma. So Sri Lankan nurse established the National Emergency Nurses Association. As you remember, maybe 2 years ago, in Easter 2019, there was a terrorist attack targeting many random peoples in Easter Day at Colombo. At that time, the trained emergency nurses cared for patients there. I was very proud with them because I think it is a real good outcome from ODA project. As the experience of Sri Lanka project, I start again about the nursing improvements in Lao PDR from 2020 to 2026. These days, the second years. The title is Enhancement of Nurses' Competencies through Remodeling of Nursing Curriculum and Improvement of a Healthcare Environment in Lao PDR. Because Inje University has performed the ODA project with the Lao PDR, I've experienced special lectures for Lao nurses before then. So, although the project was kicked off because of COVID-19, the MOU was postponed. So, on this June, the MOU ceremony was held with a synchronous webinar. Actually, from COVID-19, almost classes for last 4 semesters opened online. Not only Korea, but also the Lao PDR multimedia system was very needed. So we supported the multimedia systems. Without IT system, we cannot do anything. Furthermore, I developed educational materials with Lao language about COVID virus pathophysiology and prevention of infectious disease. Okay. Yes, this film is the first LUPIC workshop at Vientiane last summer. Even though COVID-19, I visited Vientiane and met my partners. Like IDCP workshop of Sri Lanka, LUPIC workshop will be continued until they can do it by themselves. In Lao PDR, I organized 3 committees: Nursing Curriculum Development Committees and Nursing Practicum Development Committee and National Nurses License Examinations Committees. So in that time, I did the workshop with their committees. Yes, I will not stop this workshop until they can do it by themselves. The budget is 2.5 billion won, about $2 million. And there are 3 subject goals. The first one is remodel and upgrade the UHS, the nursing curriculum. Actually, UHS, the leader, just one full bachelor degree nursing courses. So they need the remodeling and upgrade it. And the second is strengthen professors' competencies. And third is the improvement of Lao healthcare environment. So the final goal is the leading role performance of nursing education in Lao PDR and improvement of national nurse care, healthcare indicators. A global pandemic needs strong nursing staff engagement in clinical management, awareness, and acknowledgement, and knowledge exchange, and public safety. I ask your concern. Thank you for your attention.
네, 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Oh. Actually, the projects that you've introduced to us are quite meaningful projects to be engaged in the era of COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my appreciation to you and the staff members who are making efforts to increase the competency of nurses. I'd like to invite next speaker. He is the director of the Division of Bridge Program of the Korean National Commission for UNESCO. He will deliver a presentation under the title of Building a Bridge to Educational Recovery through the Bridge Program. I would like to give you 10 minutes for your presentation. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon, all participants of 2021 International Education Forum. This is Jun Ho-ju, in charge of Bridge Program of KNCU, which aims to help marginalized people have right to education throughout the non-formal education sector. I'm very glad to have a chance to introduce our program in the very meaningful event. The title of my presentation is Building a Bridge to Educational Recovery through the Bridge Program.
To share with you my presentation, I'd like to proceed with it in order of introduction to the bridge program, responses to the challenges of COVID-19, and insights observed under COVID-19. And I have some pictures of the program to share with you. I'm not sure how well you recognize UNESCO. Actually, UNESCO, the UNESCO stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which was established in 1945, right after the World War II, to contribute to the building of peace and sustainable development all over the world. And under each constitution, every member state is recommended to establish a national commission for UNESCO to spread out and implement the missions of UNESCO within and outside of each member state. Actually, South Korea joined UNESCO in June 1950. However, we didn't establish National Commission for UNESCO at that time, because unfortunately the Korean War broke out right after joining the UNESCO. So the Korean National Commission for UNESCO, KNC, was officially founded in January 1954, around 3.5 years later after joining the UNESCO. Even though setting up the KNCU needed way more time rather than we expected, there were some precious memories for the help of UNESCO, and still many Koreans remember that help. Actually, during the post-war rehabilitation, UNESCO became a stepping stone towards the reconstruction and development of Korea by supporting the construction of printing factory for primary and lower secondary school textbooks. So due to the educational help from the UNESCO, we Korean people could continue teaching and educating our children and youth with these textbooks. So based on power of education, we Korean people could reconstruct and develop our country by ourselves. In line with this context, KNCU have been working actively to strengthen cooperative ties among the UNESCO, the Korean government, and many other UNESCO-related organizations within and outside of the Republic of Korea. So the bridge program is also one of these kind of efforts of KNCU as well. And another important background of the program is lack of education and relevant education goals of international community. According to the UIS, UNESCO Institute for Statistics, there are still 750 million adults who cannot read and write, and more than 260 million youth and children who are out of school. As we all know well, lack of education exacerbates poverty, hygiene, gender equality, and many other cross-cutting issues all over the world. So to deal with this matter, international community have been working together to spread out the right to education, sharing the same goals for many years. Currently, Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning for all, is following previous MDG2 and EFA. Under these educational goals, KNCU has started Bridge program in 2010, Bridge Africa program in the Sub-Saharan African region, and Bridge Asia program in the Southern Asian region have been implemented around 10 years. And all of the country projects under the Bridge Asia and Africa program have been terminated sequentially with great result. And based on insights that came from the previous Bridge Africa and Asia program, KNCU launched second phase of Bridge program in 2020, which is called as UNESCO NACAM's Partnership Program for SDG4, because we are inviting national commissions for UNESCO as our partnered organizations under the second phase of Bridge program. Actually, national commissions for UNESCO have a mandate to implement the missions of UNESCO within country level. And also almost all NACAMs are under the Ministry of Education. That means they could make a country project more scalable with their connections to various educational organizations, spreading out the effectiveness and impact of a country project into the national level, not just into the project side. And aside from it, we have one more program named Bridge Sejong program, which is also called Partnership Program for UNESCO King Sejong Literacy Prize winners. The UNESCO King Sejong Literacy Prize is one of the international literacy prizes of the UNESCO, and it was created in 1989, supported by the Korean government. It rewards the activities of governmental agencies or non-governmental organizations displaying and achieving effective results in contributing to the fight for literacy. So as of 2021, we have a program with national commissions for UNESCO and a program with laureates of King Sejong Literacy Prize. To summarize our program, I'd like to show you a program framework which was drawn based on result-based approach. The framework has a hierarchy with 4 levels, consisting of 1 goal, 2 levels of objectives, and relevant activities. The goal of the program is to help our partner organizations achieve sustainable development goals in their countries. To achieve it, we set 2 levels of objectives. The first level 1 is kind of intermediate objective, which is to enhance access to quality education for marginalized people. As I mentioned before, there are still many marginalized people who excluded from formal education. So we are trying to increase educational opportunities for those who are out of school or over the age of attending schools remaining illiterate. To achieve it, we set 3 short-term objectives, and each short-term one is very closely related with relevant activities. The first short-term one is improve access to education for marginalized people. To achieve it, we are supporting activities of policy development of non-formal education and lifelong learning education sectors. And also we are supporting activities of operation of community learning centers. Actually, community learning center is a focal place for lifelong learning in remote and rural area for educationally marginalized people. And also we are supporting activities of provision of learning programs, such as literacy program and equivalency program for primary and rural secondary school levels, and various technical and vocational education and training as well. And the next short-term objective is improve quality of education. And to achieve it, we are supporting activities of teacher training of non-formal education sector, and also we are supporting activities of development and distribution of learning materials to learners and teachers under the bridge program. And these types of activities under the 2 short-term objectives are forming every bridge country project under the bridge program. That means bridge Lao project or Timor-Leste project is made up of these kind of activities. And the last short-term objective is to build the capacity of partner country, including KNCU. I believe that it is very important factor under the bridge program, because every country project under the bridge program is designed and implemented by our partner country. So to increase effectiveness and impact of our program, it is very important factor. So to deal with this issue, we KNCU are trying to hold annual training workshop for bridge program partners, sharing the recent information of non-formal education and lifelong learning education policies and strategies, and increasing various insights from the project site, and strengthening the relationship among bridge program partners. Considering the time I have, I'd like to skip some slides. Now that I have introduced our program, I'd like to share some responses to the challenges of COVID-19. Same as other international development cooperation program, bridge program has been in hard time under the pandemic. However, we are overcoming the obstacles to some extent with 3 main factors at the program level. The first thing is the increased accessibility through pre-established online cooperative system. Actually, in the case of bridge program, all of the main processes of project management, from the proposal to evaluation, are designed and monitored based on online platform like Google Drive, using Google Docs, Google Slides, and Google Sheets. This platform enables us to work and collaborate together on a real-time basis. And in addition to that, under the pandemic that keeps us from reaching our project site, we added online tools for video meetings between partner NACOMs, in addition to the pre-established monthly online reporting system. And second one is cooperative efforts for localization of project implementation. Actually, every country project is designed with ownership of NACOMs for UNESCO and related government organizations based on national education development policies. Furthermore, to make project more localized, we encourage local experts related to the International Development Cooperation Program to take part in the project implementation. Last one is a special project for health literacy to promote and strengthen responsive capabilities to COVID-19 for marginalized people. Under the special project, Community Learning Center is functioning as a hub for raising awareness of COVID-19 response, disseminating hygiene products to learners to enhance access to education. As of 2020, there were 4 special projects, Laos and Timor-Leste under the second phase of Bridge program, and Botswana and Eswatini under the Bridge Africa program. All of these projects were implemented with the help of government agencies related to health and sanitation. In Laos, we cooperated with the Ministry of Health in Laos, adding to the pre-established partner modalities in Bridge Lao project. The special project in Laos mainly consists of public health and hygiene workshops, distribution of health and hygiene items like face masks and hand sanitizer, and print and distribution of posters on COVID-19 prevention and response. In case of Timor-Leste, we also cooperated with the Ministry of Health in Laos, adding to the pre-established partner organizations in the Timor-Leste project. And under this special project, the main activities of the special project in Timor-Leste were made up of workshops linked to communities and unitary university for public health and hygiene, and distribution of health and hygiene items like face masks and hand sanitizers. There are some pictures of responses to COVID-19 in Laos and Timor-Leste. When it comes to the sustainability factors under the COVID-19, first of all, I'd like to tell the partnership of National Commission for UNESCO, which makes the Bridge program intergovernmental cooperation project under education-related ministries. And second one is a unique government system of Bridge program, which is called as Bridge National Committee. It is an operational, advisory, and cooperation structure involving representatives from education-related sections of central and local government, strengthening the link between educational policies and government organizations. Also, there are more sustainable factors like ownership of partner countries through project localization, strengthened access to educational facilities through special projects for health literacy, and stable and pre-established online monitoring systems with partner outcomes. Even though we are overcoming the obstacles based on sustainable factors at the project level, there are still remnants of challenges of COVID-19. Actually, every country project under the Bridge program is run in the vulnerable, underdeveloped, and remote areas. That means there are still limitations of educational alternatives, suffering lack of internet environment and educational content and curriculums for remote and contactless education. Also, there are difficulties of mutual M&E because of lack of project site visit by KNCU. And also, we are losing many opportunities for offline peer learning based on international partnerships among various stakeholders. As I wrap up my presentation, I'd like to talk about the cooperation strategies for the post-corona era. Based on insights that came from project implementation under the pandemic, I learned that we have to reinforce the role and accountability of governments of partner countries in ODA project to increase efficient management of environmental risk at the government level. And also, additional research on education development policy of partner countries should be needed in the post-corona era to timely grasp on-site demand. And also, I think that we have to strengthen support for improvement to education policies in partner countries like distance education or online education management information system. Considering the corona era, we have to address health and health risks as key assumptions of pre-designed PDMs in existing projects. And also we have to apply health and health risk as a cross-cutting issue into logical frameworks when we design new projects. When it comes to Sustainable Development Goal 4, we have to expand support related to target 4.5 for enhancing equal access to education, and 4.8 for inclusive and effective learning environment for all to overcome the losses in education for the vulnerable due to COVID-19. Last but not least, I believe that we have to strengthen linkages between SDG3 for good health and well-being and SDG6 for clean water and sanitation and projects related to SDG4. There are some pictures of the program. If you allow me some time, I'd like to share with this picture. These are pictures for class for disabled and adult women in Malawi, and last one is a picture of secondary education teacher training in non-formal education in Eswatini. This is a picture of newly built community learning center in Botswana. Actually, this community learning center is built with the help of Sumijo, a world-renowned soprano vocalist and UNESCO artist for peace. So they are signboards at the CRC. It is a picture of early childhood development education in Botswana. And this is a picture of English literacy measurement tool and certificate in Eswatini. And these are pictures of literacy class for adult women in India and vocational training for adult women in Pakistan. And these are pictures of classes for equivalence program and out-of-school children in Laos. And these are pictures of health and hygiene workshop and teacher training in non-formal education in Timor-Leste. This is a last picture. It's just of CLC and toilet under construction in Timor-Leste. That's all I prepared for my presentation. Thank you for paying your attention. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
예, 대단히 감사합니다, 조 팀장님.
Thank you very much, Director Jo. While listening to your presentation, I just came with the thought that those who are out of school and others still have a great passion for learning, and the Bridge program is focusing on the vulnerable and isolated ones. And I hope that the Bridge program will continue to last. And also, your idea about the cooperation project is quite insightful.
The next presenter is Han Sung-min, educational researcher of Daegu Institute for Creativity and Convergence Education. And Mr. Han is a former educational researcher of the Teacher Policy Division, Ministry of Education, and former teacher at Daegu Software Meister High School. His presentation is titled The Changed Education Field, the Era of Digital Learning Era. Good afternoon. As introduced, I am educational researcher of Daegu Institute for Creativity and Convergence Education. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here as a presenter. I will be talking today about a changed education field in the era of digital learning. First, I would like to give you a brief introduction of the Daegu Institute for Creativity and Convergence Education. We are placed under the Daegu Metropolitan Office of Education, and our history goes back 48 years. And we focus on science and technology, and we focus on creativity without the barriers of different subjects. We are collaborating with the Bangladesh Ministry of Education since 2005. So the Daegu Office of Education and the Ministry of Education of Bangladesh have been engaged in ICT exchange and cooperation since 2005. And we have provided invitational training in Korea. And we provided this training for 10 days in June In 2019, we made a music video, and we also provided classes and also opportunities to experience the Korean culture. And then we also, of course, visited Bangladesh as well and provided support there. However, due to COVID pandemic in 2020, we needed to make changes to the invitational training program. We had to transform our offline learning into an online program, and what we did was we expanded the number of students. So we selected 40 teachers from Bangladesh to take part. The Ministry of Education was in charge of providing smart pads, Bluetooth keyboards, and also earphones to the course recipients. In 2021, we went a step further from 2020, and we provided real-time video training and conferencing in the form of webinars. And in order to enhance the capacity building, we provided a KWAK and ICT classroom project. And it was an interactive, real-time video training and conferencing. In the training program, the Korean Education Ministry in 2019 established a ICT classroom in Bangladesh. And we developed education programs that can be carried out in that classroom. Due to COVID-19, we made many changes, and I would now like to elaborate on the changes in 3 parts. The first is we maintained communication and exchange, and in order to do that, we built a community with the students. In 2020, there were 60 Korean and Bangladesh teachers on the Naver Band platform. In 2021, you can see that there were 67 people and 54 people in the ICT classroom. At Daegu Lead, we have teachers from elementary, middle, and high school teachers. And these people are very committed to educational ODA, and most of the teachers have been taking part since 2019. And other educational offices are taking part in this project as well, and we are facilitating communication between them. And so through Naver Band, we share our online program, and we can also check attendance based on the contents provided, and people can also use the chat function to post questions and receive answers. And sometimes discussions are held through the chat rooms, and people can build relationships. And so what we did to further relationship was we matched one Korean teacher with 4 to 5 Bangladesh teachers, and we provided group mentoring and group training. And as you can see, these groups went off on their own, and they also made their own chat rooms on Naver Band, and they were free to ask many questions. And of course, AI translations actually was a great help. And Bangladesh teachers are not very fluent in English, and so we used translation apps to provide training and exchange in their language. The second effort that we made was to provide content for common modules. In 2020, the 17 educational offices developed a online course, and we uploaded this regularly on the Naver Band because they covered topics that Bangladesh teachers wanted to learn about regarding digital literacy and utilizing edutech and AI. And we did not want to simply watch the videos. We provided guidelines on how to watch the videos, and we also attached the videos with 9 assignments so that the teachers would not simply watch the videos but also take part in activities. So we provided guidelines in basic and intermediary form, and the teachers were able to utilize the videos based on their level of competency. And we uploaded the assignments on the Naver Band, and we asked the teachers to upload their assignments as well. And the Bangladesh teachers were actually very active in posting their completed assignments, and the Korean teachers were very impressed. What you see here is an assignment related to AI, and the second one is a assignment introducing Bangladesh via video. And the third is a presentation on introducing Bangladesh and their own family members. So based on our experience of 2020 and 2021, we also provided real-time video training and conferencing in the form of webinars. So as a follow-up of KWAK and ICT Classroom Project, this is what we did. So in KWAK, what we did was we provided contents by carrying out a survey in advance. If you look at the content, you can see here we have prepared courses for preparing real-time video training, documentation and presentation, shooting and filming, creating and sharing videos, online collaborative learning, and unplugged activities in artificial intelligence. In the ICT Classroom Project follow-up courses, we provided theory and practice of ICT utilization classes, understanding the functions and basic usage of hardware and software, and we also shared real cases. And of course, after we decided that we were going to carry out real-time online courses, we were concerned. We were not sure if we were able to carry out the courses because of the poor infrastructure in Bangladesh, and we were also concerned that teachers might not be able to connect to Zoom. We selected Zoom as our platform, and we were concerned that teachers may not be able to utilize Zoom or other apps that we decided to use in our course. But despite these concerns, we carried out seminars with the teachers prior 3 times, and we carry out many measures, and we consulted with many experts in order to overcome these challenges. And we also developed our own material to provide online through our Zoom courses. And we also talked with the Bangladesh teachers about their schedule. And we carried out this training for a week from 3 o'clock Bangladesh time. On Monday, July 26, 2021, we were very excited and we carried out the first regular real-time video training. We had an interpreter and we had an assistant teacher who checked the chat rooms, and we had another assistant teacher who served as an engineer who checked the attendance and who checked all the other technical aspects. And the Bangladesh teachers, they signed on from their home and their offices. And in order to commemorate the fact that we were meeting online, we all drew hearts with our arms and we took a snapshot. So as I mentioned earlier, we were very concerned, but we carried out this real-time video training for 5 days, and all 42 Bangladesh teachers attended the course. And of course, the connection was not perfect, and we couldn't cater to everyone's different situation. But I think that overall, the course was successful. Here you can see the outcomes of the training that was carried out in 2021. First, Bangladesh teachers wanted pre-recorded courses, so we uploaded some on a Naver Band. And the real-time training video, I think, was a very important memorabilia for the participants, and it was also a driver for innovation. As for the group consulting, based on the success of our real-time training, we decided to further this. And so we have operated real-time consulting for the Bangladesh teachers, and we were also able to enjoy many different outcomes. So here you can see the questions or the questionnaires or the surveys that we provided to the Bangladesh teachers on what they wanted and any know-how that they hope to share with us. And we provided this consulting based on themes. So instead of providing this to all the teachers, we categorized consultation into themes. And for instance, we had one on metaverse, and the Bangladesh teachers could take part in the metaverse experience. And although there were some connection issues, I think that this was a very exciting session. And so with active participation for about 5 days, more than 30 teachers took part, and they got new information. They were able to experience the new themes. And also, with the ICT classrooms, we analyzed the status of the ICT classroom projects and the needs of the teachers. And so we provided courses on how to edit videos, how to manage and maintain the ICT classroom projects, and also teaching learning methods of ICT using this platform. And so we provided 8 courses in all. Also, we provided real-time courses where the participants could ask questions and engage in discussion in real time. And here you can see that the classroom project curriculum that was established. And through sustainable exchange and cooperation, we have provided video contents regarding Korean traditional culture, and we are doing this to enhance the understanding of each other's countries. Also, for Korean teachers who are very busy with their daily work, in order to motivate them, we also made sure that their efforts were known to the media, and this was our way of motivating the teachers. And we also had a forum where we shared our achievements and results. And this was an opportunity for all the teachers to share best practices and best cases. After the training through the band, we can see continued and sustained exchange. If you look at the survey results in 2020 in terms of adequacy, efficacy, and impact and sustainability, we achieved around 92.8 points in 5 categories. And there was also a demand for real-time classes, and we reflected this. And in 2021, in the same 5 categories, we scored 94.8 points. And next year, we are going to enhance the project by providing in-depth AI classes and also by reflecting the Bangladesh curriculum into the real-time training program. And I think that real cooperation was possible because this training program is for the mid to long term. Furthermore, the Bangladesh teachers, I think it is important for us to be able to meet them face to face. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Despite the fact that movement was limited due to COVID-19, it's inspiring to see that you use Naver Band and that you created a learning community with the teachers in Bangladesh. I'm very impressed by this presentation. Thank you for sharing your experience. Now let me introduce the last presenter.
The last presenter of session C is from KWAK, Korea International Cooperation Agency, Director Hai-Jeong. She served as the Senior Education Specialist as well as former Research Fellow of CARIS. She will deliver a presentation under the title of KWAK Education Sector Strategy in the Pandemic Era. Please go ahead with your presentation. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hai-Jeong, Director of KWAK SDG program. Today, I would like to talk about the activities of KWAK, the Korea's aid agency, which is in charge of international cooperation between Korea and other developing countries, particularly in terms of the concessional aid. We've pursued ABC program as a part of KWAK activities, and we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic is going beyond the health crisis. Rather, it has a very negative impact on education. So I would like to talk about our midterm strategy in response to COVID-19 situation. As you can see on the screen, KWAK back in 2020, when the COVID-19 virus spread, decided to come up with a systematic response to the emergency situation caused by COVID-19 pandemic. And we just came up with this ABC program to provide relevant aid to the developing countries. So A stands for Action on Fragility, which is about emergency support for the vulnerable countries, like a test kit, facial masks, or the diagnostic facilities. And the general education or campaign activities promoting the hygiene-related activities such as washing hands. And B stands for Building Capacity, which is to provide medical staff competency building programs to our partner countries. And also, we just engaged ourselves in providing program to develop the epidemiological investigation specialists in our partner countries. KWAK actually constructed and provided 10 to 15 large hospitals in our partner countries, and we provided relevant the COVID-19 treatment facilities like walk-through test centers or the booth as a part of building capacity program, and systems for a comprehensive partnership. And we provided relevant funding to 4 partner companies to further promote the comprehensive partnership. So the ABC program was a comprehensive system to provide integrated response to the COVID-19 situation. And around $150 million was supported, and around 38 million people benefited from that funding. And that fund was provided as a part of emergency funding. And KWAK has 44 offices around the world. And we engaged not only the KWAK offices in the countries around the world, but also we actually supported 116 countries and while implementing 24 rapid response programs. When it comes to the school education sector or the vocational education center, we provided COVID-19 related response kits such as facial masks, test kits, or campaign materials. Kind of the education materials to encourage people to wash their hands or have a kind of etiquette when they cough. So we just provided the training materials or the workshop materials to the relevant education agencies in our partner countries. Furthermore, e-learning was a kind of the sector which had a great demand. However, in the developing countries, the e-learning infrastructure was not relevantly established. So we provided the needed equipments through the education centers or universities that we worked together in the past. We also provided the contents development resources to boost the spread of e-learning in a relatively short period of time. So when it comes to the e-learning, we spent $1.5 million benefiting 430,000 people, helping them address the education loss caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. KWAK internally comes up with midterm strategy for education sector with the adoption of SDG, we just came up with the first phase of the education-related midterm strategy. And currently, we are working on the second phase of midterm strategy, targeting the period between 2021 and 2025. And we also have a linkage or kind of connection with a new diplomatic policy of Korea, such as new Southern policy or new Northern policies. So when it comes to our international cooperation program, we reflect the new initiatives in terms of the Korean diplomacy. So overall, we just came up with a vision of inclusive development through quality education, which is closely related to SDG goals. And we all know that there is a serious concern over the equality of education. So we spend a lot of resources for the support of the vulnerable people in terms of equality of education. And we just provide the programs in terms of the literacy programs or the training material, the education material or programs provided to those who are vulnerable. And also, secondly, we provide the programs for the teacher training, because the teacher's capability matters a lot to achieve equitable and high quality education. We also care for those who are out of school, particularly the youth out of school or the adult women who do not have the opportunities for relevant education. And they are the targets that we spend a lot of time and resources for support in terms of the education sector. And the youth or the young the others who are isolated in remote areas are also another target for our intensive investment. And the second part is the digital education. In our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we faced with the demand for digitalization of our education infrastructure, and ABC program was an emergency response program. And as a part of the ABC program, we provided e-learning support, and that e-learning support activities have been developed in a bigger scale at the international level. So a lot of the education projects are related to the digitization of the learning centers, particularly not only in the university education, but also even in primary schools. So when there is a health emergency or the crisis occurs like the COVID-19 pandemic, the education should be provided without any interruption by digitalizing the education infrastructure. That is the second, the midterm goal of KWAK. And the third midterm goal is the Tibet and higher education for youth empowerment. We emphasize the partnership with the partner countries. And the Ministry of Education of Korea tries to build the partnership in the field of higher education, particularly focusing on Tibet and the secondary or higher education. As mentioned in the previous slides, the first strategic goal of KWAK in its midterm plan is related to SDG 4, like a quality education for learning outcomes. And we focus a lot on the improvement of academic achievement of children, particularly in terms of basic skills. We focus on the Middle East countries and the Southeast Asian countries, particularly the conflicted areas. So we can help the education in the children, for the children in the refugee camp, while empowering them through the medium of education. And the second midterm goal is related to the digitization of education, the media or the methods. Here in Korea, the KMOOC has been newly introduced and gaining popularity. So the MOOC-like system is widely demanded in Southeast Asian countries. And also when it comes to the African region, based on the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic situation, there is a growing demand for digitization of the education infrastructure, including online learning. And third, the midterm strategy is related to the Tibet improvement of Tibet or training and vocation, the technical and vocational training for the youth, which is related to the SDG 4.1. So we are targeting the young adults or the youth and the teachers in developing countries with regard to the digital training program. And when it comes to the higher education field, we engaged ourselves in programs targeting the youth or young adults so they can have a relevant economic means to support themselves. KWAK actually has a history of engaging such a program for quite some time. And also in developing countries, there are efforts being made to increase the enrollment rate of the young youth in higher education institutions. And the KWAK is providing supports in line with such effort of the partner companies. When we design our midterm strategies, we put priority on support for the vulnerable, particularly children, women, or the people in conflict areas. And also, we focus on evidence-based project. So that is a key trend, one of the key trends of the ODA. So ODA projects should be pursued based on data, and outcome should be focused when we design the aid project. So KWAK is faced with an imminent task of collecting and outcome-related data, such as the improvement of academic skills of children when we pursue the children education programs. And also, with regard to the TVET training, we try to collect the data with regard to the improved livelihood of the youth who got the TVET. So I think they are ongoing tasks ahead of KWAK when we pursue our support programs. This concludes my presentation on the title of KWAK Education Sector Programs in the Pandemic Era. So I just briefed you on the past activities as well as its future plan. Thank you very much. This concludes my presentation. Thank you, Director Yang. KWAK is playing a pivotal role in terms of economic cooperation of Korea with developing countries. I believe that KWAK will play a bigger role in the future as well.
We will now invite all the presenters. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. I would like to first thank all of our presenters for your presentation. We have actually received quite a lot of questions, but due to time constraints, I think I will be able to ask one question for each presenter. So I will give you time to think about the answer. So first, Lee Shi-won had a question for Professor Oh Jin-ah. After the project in Sri Lanka was completed, did the recipients or the participants of the project gather together to study further? Did you feel a need to establish a graduate program for nursing? I think the question is perhaps Sri Lanka perhaps felt the need to establish a program where they can foster nursing leaders in the future. The next question is for all presenters. I think Mr. Han Sung-min can answer this question, and also Chu Jun-ho can answer this question. How do you ensure that Korea Education Management continuously monitor the implementation of digital learning during the pandemic? And what will be the measuring tools you use to ensure successful implementation of digital learning and revision of the national curriculum during the pandemic? You have mentioned this in your presentation, but I think that there's a lot to consider with this question. So this is the question: how can we effectively measure the implementation of digital learning? And then lastly, this is a question for Ms. Yang.
In the post-COVID-19 era, what should be the priority agenda in the education sector? I really enjoyed your presentation on ABC program. So discussion is about the future program of KWAK from a comprehensive perspective. So I'd like to ask each presenter to give answer to the questions. Actually, I'd like to allocate 2.5 minutes.
Thank you for the question. We actually were funded by the National Research Foundation and the Education Minister. And so when we are evaluated, one of the indicators is whether the project is sustainable in Sri Lanka. So we monitor that because we are evaluated on that criteria. With this university, the country actually invested 20 billion won. So the first national nursing faculty has been established in Sri Lanka, and the faculty there is very working hard. And we have 3 graduates, and although we are not providing direct support, but as their mentor and former teacher, we continue to provide the support that we can when they wish to further their study. And as you mentioned, there is a need for a graduate program in Sri Lanka, and there is also great demand by the Bangladesh Education Ministry to set up a graduate program. But from our side, from the Korean Education Ministry, we do not have any programs that set up graduate schools. Most of the programs are focused on the undergraduate program. And so when they are pursuing education after the project, they have to pursue that independently for now. I think the need for a graduate school is only there because of the accumulation of education thus far.
Director Chu, so could you please answer the question? So while engaging in a development cooperation project, the biggest task ahead of me and my team members is the measurement of the outcome of the development cooperation projects, particularly in the field of digital learning. Actually, that is not a frequently visited the area when we proceed with our development cooperation projects, because our projects are focusing on the isolated or the marginalized ones, particularly who are living in remote areas. So basically, those remote areas do not have sufficient infrastructure. So if I look back on our past projects, I am not able to come up with a relevant answer to that question. But I fully understand that the digital learning has been a big topic in this pandemic era. And even after the pandemic era, we need to think about the digital learning. And to the best of my knowledge, digital learning, or the ultimate objective of digital learning project, should be pursued with the end state in our mind. And based on that end state or the final outcome in our mind, we can come up with the relevant the procedures or the methodology for our pursuit of project. There could be some issue with the digital literacy, because the learner's capability to accommodate the digital learning matters a lot to the impact of digital learning. Then we can come up with a digital literacy program, and also we need to come up with the relevant indicators when we engage ourselves in the development cooperation project for the marginalized people in remote areas. So the different activities should be designed first, and the relevant indicators should be established to measure the impact or the outcomes of the project or programs. And the digital learning itself should be aligned with the national level education policies. And that is what each digital learning related program should consider.
한 연구사님 말씀 듣겠습니다.
I think this is one of the hottest topics in the educational sector. Digital learning in the COVID pandemic era is being seen as a new method for education, but how are we going to measure the effectiveness is something that is being deeply considered by the sector. But as I mentioned earlier, last year and this year, in our case, we continued to exchange with teachers in Bangladesh, and I mentioned 5 categories in which we evaluated ourselves. Compared to last year, this year, the satisfaction level has increased based on the survey. One of the key reasons was that we did not simply provide content to be viewed online. We provided real-time consulting, and the teachers were able to ask questions face-to-face. And we were able to have frank discussions about the issues in respective education systems. And this sort of lively discussion, I think, has enhanced the overall satisfaction level. And when we're talking about measuring effectiveness, I think that is an area that we also need to think about more. But what is certain is that a blend of online and offline activities is more effective. I'm reminded of an experience of my own. When it was online, I could monitor in real time, and so I actually replaced one instructor that I was not happy with. Next, I would like to ask Ms. Yang to answer the question that was asked to her.
So we are actually holding an International Education Forum for 2 days, yesterday and today. And in terms of KWAK, actually we are working with the developing countries as partner countries. And when we pursue the ABCE programs, we just came up with the realization that we need to focus on specific areas because the Korea is not a largest donor country, and actually we need to be very keen on identifying the relevant specific areas. Well, we need to make investment in, and currently the 5 to 6 year long-term project take up like 60% of the total resources of KWAK. And once we actually identify our KWAK project for the year 2023, then it will last like 5 or 6 years up until 2028 or 2030. And based on the outcome data of those projects, we will measure how large the impact of our support program was. So while you're working on the design of our future projects, we realign in the past projects as well as the future activities. So when it comes to the basic skill education, we focus on SDG41, and also when it comes to the higher education program, we focus on SDG 4.3. And so what we actually working on or focusing on increasing the accessibility to education as well as improving the quality of higher education. And also another area of focus is how we can converge ICT technology into the learning sector and how we can collect relevant data and measure the relevant outcomes of our project. That will be our next 5-year plan.
It seems like you all gave us the concluding comments. 2030 seems far away, but I believe you are saying that what we do now is determine what will happen in the future. So thank you for sharing your experience and insights. I would like to thank all the presenters, and with that, I would like to conclude the session.
네, 세션 C는 이렇게 마무리를 하겠습니다.
This concludes session C, and
13분을 지나고 있는데요.
it's 4:13 right now, and we'll take a 5-minute break
4시 18분.
and get started with
프롬을 다시 시작하도록 하겠습니다.
the session number session D at 4:15. We've prepared ODA video clip. Please enjoy while you are resting during the break. Thank you very much.
2021년 7월 2일 UN 무역개발회의는 대한민국을 선진국으로 재분류했습니다. 대한민국은 개발도상국에서 선진국으로 지위가 향상된 최초의 국가입니다. 그리고 교육은 나라를 성장하게 하는 중요한 요소였습니다. 국가 발전에 무엇보다 중요한 교육. 한국은 1967년부터 교육 공적 개발 원조 사업을 통해 개발도상국을 지원해 왔습니다. 2015년 유엔은 지속가능 발전 목표를 국제 의제로 채택하며 인류의 지속 가능한 발전을 위한 교육의 역할을 강조했습니다. 네 번째 목표인 양질의 교육. 대한민국은 포용적이고 형평성 있는 양질의 교육을 지원하기 위해 다양한 교육 ODA 사업을 추진하고 있습니다. 때로는 위기를 마주하기도 합니다. 그리고 급격하게 변화하는 미래에 대한 두려움도 있습니다. 하지만 어떤 상황에도 배움이 계속될 수 있도록 돕고
I thank Makerere University for organizing this program for us under the CHAEs because we learn and when we go back, information delivered to the students within a little time, and all of them are happy, and all of them have learned, and they are really interactive.
And these teachers, they are well placed to teach the students, the learners, to use the ICT applications and different platforms in teaching and learning. When these students know how to use ICTs in teaching and learning, and even for searching for useful information, these students should be digitally literate.
미래 사회를 대비하여 양질의 일자리를 꿈꿀 수 있도록 지원하며
Hello, my name is Maureen Eleka. I am studying at PC Kinyanjui Technical Training Institute in Nairobi, Kenya. Through the Bear 2 project, I have learned how to design solar systems. During my study, I have learned about renewable sources of energy. By using solar backup instead of generators, we can reduce electricity bills. After the training, I can be self-employed as a solar expert. Also, I can be a trainer in the future. I believe the training will help to improve the living standard and raise the economy locally since solar energy can be used in many fields.
국가와 공동체의 발전을 이끌어갈 인재를 육성하도록
안녕하세요. 저는 베제대학교 신소재공학과에서 석사과정은 마신 뱀입니다. 저는 베제대학교 석사과정은 세력공학과를 배웠습니다. 라오스에서는 학부과정 공부했을 때 물리학 공부하였습니다. 라오스보다 한국에서 좀 더 깊고 성확하게 배웠습니다. 그리고 많은 실험하였습니다. 실험은 한때 사용하는 장비도 배웠고 분석하는 것도 배웠습니다. 제가 라오스의 수파누공대학교 신소재공학과에서 학생들은 가르쳐서 한국에서 배운 실험 장비 분석은 라오스 학생들에게만 해줄 수 있습니다. 그리고 학생들 직접 해볼 수 있습니다. 기회가 된다면 다시 한번 한국에서 공부하고 싶습니다. 감사합니다.
우리 모두가 더불어 잘 사는 지구 공동체를 만들기 위해 세계 시민을 길러냅니다.
What I've learned in citizenship is that all of us, I think, we've learned the importance of being citizens of a specific country, and we respect each other equally because we have understood the rights of each one of us.
My name is Bernard Chaboro. I'm from CHAE School, Form 2. I learned citizenship in Form 1. It's changed how I see different people from different culture.
교육은 우리 모두의 기본적인 권리이자 미래를 향한 열쇠이기에 한국은 앞으로도 교육 발전을 지원하여 우리 모두를 위한 더 밝은 미래를 만들어 갈 것입니다. 미래를 위한 나눔의 대한민국이 함께합니다.
네. 이제 마지막 세션 D를 시작할 순서입니다. 세션 D.
We will now begin the last session. The last session is the South Korean educational ODA's next steps for educational recovery. The moderator of this session is Professor Jung-Ju, who is a professor of public administration at Yonsei University and who is also an associate dean at the Graduate School of Public University of the same university and the assistant professor of East Asian Languages and Cultures of Indiana University.
네, 안녕하세요. 연세대학교 행정학과 정원주
Good
교수입니다.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm
세션 D는
Professor
한국
Jung-Ju
교육개발협력의
from Public
비전과
Administration
전략
Division of
모색을
Yonsei University, and Session D will be proceeded on the theme of South Korean educational ODA's next steps for educational recovery, particularly policy at the direction of South Korea in the post-COVID-19 era. I'd like to invite the first speaker of Session D, Professor Park Kwon-bo of Chungnam National University. He will deliver a presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I'm Kwon-bo Park, Associate Professor of the Education Department of Chungnam National University. I would like to talk about the changes and challenges in Korea's education, ODA, and in doing so, I would like to think about the future of education ODA. So the topic I am going to cover is quite broad, so I want to take a look back at educational ODA in Korea in the past and the present, and also think about, in that sense, what we can expect in the future. Since the late 1990s, ODA, Korea began to provide ODA, and education ODA began in 2004. And the direction at the time was to export Korea's educational service. So it was about how we can export Korea's educational service, how we can share Korea's experience in the education sector. The direction was a focus on the economy and enhancing the wealth or health of the developing countries. So in some sense, it was in line with the interest of the developing countries, but in another sense, it was not. After Korea joined OECD, ODA started to increase exponentially, and there was heightened interest in Korea's education. And as was mentioned by many presenters, I'm sure, financial resources in the education sector also increased. And so at this this juncture, there was a transition in the direction of educational ODA. People start to think about how we can contribute to education in the global community. And then 2015, after the SDGs were adopted, or actually before, in May of that year, Korea was greatly involved in setting up the goals for the education in SDG. So we needed to move on from just simply exporting Korea's educational experience and services. There was a need to discuss the issue as a global agenda. So instead of unilateral assistance to developing countries, the focus was that we needed to work with our developing country partners together in providing educational ODA. And in experiencing COVID-19, I think it became very clear that we need to stick together. And of course, these non-face-to-face meetings was not an option but a necessity. But through this experience, we were reminded of the importance of communication. So let's take a look at what the place that education secured in MDGs. So some EFAs were actually embedded into the Millennium Development Goals. And at the time, the consideration was made that if education was not embedded in the international development agenda in order to secure finance for education. But as you can see, not all the goals of EFA was embedded into MDGs. And in SDGs, as you know, it was very important to have a separate independent goal for education. And within SDGs, education has a standalone goal, but because of this, the interconnectedness with other goals was weakened. The goal of education in itself is important, but education is also a foundation for growth in other sectors. And of course, we highlight this all the time, but at the same time, carving out an independent sector within these global agendas and sustainable goals is very important. So basically, the initiative or the leadership that education needs to take as a goal has been what was considered so far. So there is a legal framework for ODA. Korea provides ODA based on the Framework Act on International Development Cooperation. And of course, educational ODA is also governed by national strategies related to ODA. As mentioned by the previous presenter, the focus is this in setting educational ODA goals. And so you can see that recently the strategic objectives have all been linked to different SDG goals and targets. As I mentioned earlier, educational ODA has continued to rise over the years, and the educational sector has always secured a certain percentage of total ODA. This means that Korea places and increasingly places great importance on educational ODA. If you look at the projects by the Education Ministry, you can see that the largest share is taken up by scholarships and aside from fostering talent, you can see that the projects are not that many. Education Ministry, however, still pursues a lot of projects, and so quantitatively and qualitatively speaking, the educational ODA in Korea has continued to expand. And in this process, there are many challenges that we need to consider. First is the purpose of education ODA going forward. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the beginning of educational ODA in Korea was to export educational services and experiences, and will we continue down this path, or will we complement it with other goals and purposes? And I think we are at a juncture where we need to consider this. We need to contribute to the global community, but we need to look beyond the COVID pandemic and now, and think about how we are going to contribute to the future. Once we establish the purpose, then we will have to think about the governance. Governance is about bringing in expert agencies and expert organizations, but at the same time, building a more comprehensive governance that allows for many different actors. If you think about the challenges in education ODA, in the past, a lot of the ODA projects pertain to providing hardware. So there were a lot of limitations, and there came a point when we stopped hardware. But I think that just because we faced difficulties, that doesn't mean that we have to stop the relevant project. As you can see, there are still many regions and countries that still need the hardware and that still need the infrastructure. However, because these projects, the projects failed because these hardware were not integrated into the software or the curriculum of the recipient countries. And another challenge relates to the feature of educational ODA. I'm sure that everybody agrees that when it comes to education, the outcomes or the results come out after quite a long period of time. So you need to have a very long-term view. But given the features of projects, the short-term, immediate results are oftentimes demanded. So most successful education ODA projects are long-term supported projects. For instance, teacher training programs. The successful programs are very long-term, 5 to 7 years, and they are based on trust. And so we need to move away from demanding very visible and tangible results early on in the project. Also, we need to reflect the needs of partner countries. And many times we do not know well about the recipient countries. Not enough homework has been done. Here in this picture, you can see a boy in a Rwandan school, and this is a rural area in Rwanda, and the boy is receiving coding education. And I'm sure that this is very unfamiliar because many people believe that all the children are starving in Rwanda, but we need to take a look at our recipient countries with fresh eyes. Also, there's greater demand for Korean education and education on Korea, and we need to think about how much we can provide this and foster cooperation along the way. And we also need to bridge the education ODA and the national education. There is not a strong link between national education and education ODA. The education ODA is considered a project, and then you have a separate project for the field, and you have a separate project for education in Korea. So there are a few cases where teacher and students engaged in exchange programs, and some of these programs are related to global citizenship education, and this is linked with ICT. For instance, we had students come together in classes regarding global citizenship education. So these are some of the case examples that we can think about. And if you look at the educational ODA overseas, there are many different contents and many different modalities. Good Neighbors International project is what you can see on the slide. The CSO and the government and companies and the private sector all came together to put together this project, and the outcome was also very diverse. This was a project carried out by Educators Without Borders. So what they did was they integrated literacy education with health education. And these are some case examples that we need to consider. Instead of thinking about one subject or one topic of educational ODA, we can integrate different elements. And also in Southeast Asia, many countries are building a blended learning platform. And we need to look back on how much we understand this. Like, for instance, for countries that already have this platform, what kind of contributions can we make? What kind of contents can we provide? So, in short, educational ODA for educational recovery is as follows. So we need to respond to the need for digital education. What kind of cooperation can we engage in? For instance, we need a more holistic sort of approach, and we also respond to the need for health education. We need to collaborate in this sector. We need to foster experts, and we also need to provide more health education in the primary and secondary levels as well. And we also need to provide support for safety education as well. And we also need to provide continued support for continuous learning. Of course, this is a challenge both at home and abroad. How are we going to deal with school disruptions? As I said, this is an issue that is faced both phase and abroad, and so we can collaborate internationally to come up with solutions. And lastly, we need to discuss the new vision of future education. The goal of future education is to live together in prosperity, and in that sense, we would have to provide a peace education or global citizenship education. In other words, we need to set a direction and then think about how we are going to implement that and achieve that. And so in order to do that, we also need to change the methodology. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, instead of focusing on short-term tangible results, we need more long-term projects. And the domestic education offices and the education sector's activities can be linked with educational ODA projects. And in order to do that, we need the participation of government, the private sector, and academia. So we need a broader network of educational ODA. And we also need to foster the expertise that exists in developing countries. There are many agencies in the recipient countries and experts in the recipient countries, and we need to think about how we can utilize them and take advantage of them. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park. Professor Park talked about the status and history of educational ODA, and he also talked about the challenges posed by COVID-19, and he also talked about the opportunities that it presents. And lastly, he also gave us some proposals about the way forward.
Our next speaker is the Director Hai-Jeong of Office of Global Education Cooperation Research of KEDI, and she also is a private expert of Council of Institutions Research Grant Aid and expert member of Education Sector of KWAK. Could you please go ahead with your presentation, Director An? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hai-Jeong, Director of Office of Global Education Cooperation Research of KEDI. Today, I'd like to talk about the education issues faced by developing countries in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the direction of educational sector cooperation as a part of ODA. First of all, I'd like to talk about the educational issues faced by developing countries in the COVID-19 pandemic era. The first issue is learning loss. It seems that around 90% of students experience stopping or the interruption in their learning due to school closures worldwide, and more serious learning losses in developing countries are identified due to school closures. And also, it will be difficult to return to education even after the COVID-19 pandemic is over for those in the developing countries. And the next issue is education inequality. Decreased academic achievement is happening due to the absence of school education, and also the education bipolarization is deepened. And also increased in education equality happens by prolonged education losses of vulnerable children and adolescents. And the third issue is the well-being threats in terms of the learner's well-being. Increased the frequency of experiencing domestic violence is reported, and increased the depression, sense of isolation, and emotional anxiety is being identified. And due to the school meal discontinuation, actually malnutrition is happening in developing country. And the next issue is a remote learning related issue. That there is a growing need for various types of remote learning due to the prolonged school closures. However, in developing countries, there is low opportunity of remote learning because poor internet connections and infrastructure, and there is a growing need of context appropriate types, device, and the contents of remote learning. Now, I'd like to talk about the changes of development cooperation projects in education sector. SKEDI research on SDG4, which I led with my team members. And I would like to talk about the KEDI research, which is related to Sustainable Development Goal number 4, and the research title is Research on Education Development Cooperation to Achieve SDGs, Investigating Action Strategies. And the objective of the research is to investigate the action strategies of education development cooperation for achieving SDG4 in developing countries. Actually, it is taking care of 6 years and 7 sub-targets to come up with the relevant action plans. So if you take a look at the 4th year, the outcome of the research in the fields of education quality, the equal education access for vulnerable people was surveyed, and also we interviewed the working level of people, particularly the project managers and the practitioners from 18 Korean CSOs. And as for this year, 2021 interview, we interviewed 15 project managers and the practitioners from 10 Korean CSOs. And please refer to the research full paper, which is posted on the KEDI website for more details. And the changes made in terms of the development cooperation projects in education sector, the first change we can identify is the expansion of remote activities. However, there are certain difficulties because of the difficulties in business trips to developing countries, and that is why we are conducting remote implementation of the project or programs. And the second change is that there is a decline in educational development cooperation project because of school closures. And even if schools are not closed, there are changes required in terms of the educational development cooperation project because of the COVID-19 situation. And we all know that educational development cooperation involves personal exchanges, and the COVID-19 pandemic situation prohibits such kind of personal exchanges. Let me quote one of the answers given by our respondents. The education project received the hardest hit now because all schools were closed, and even if it's not fully closed, or even if the activity is not necessarily happening in school, other projects are now running, but gathering and training are not allowed. There are areas where people have to depend on food rations to live. So this time, as a COVID-19 support project, we are going to distribute something like the emergency package, and also the on-site or the site-oriented system should be established for efficient or effective implementation of the cooperation project. From now on, I'd like to talk about the directions of ODA for educational recovery. Actually, there is no change in our basic direction toward the implementation or the completion of SDG by 2030. In order to achieve that goal, we need to improve our education support for vulnerable people. We need to expand the quality education opportunities for vulnerable groups in consideration of their environment and context. And we also need to strengthen our cooperation with the CSOs to achieve such goal. And we also need to provide support the design of formal and non-formal education, the programs of the partner countries. But we all know that in most developing countries, it's extremely hard for us to collect the information or data with regard to the educational impact of each different vulnerable group. And the next agenda ahead of us is to support the remote education. We need to investigate infrastructure for remote learning in local communities, and also we can come up with the remote education service that can be immediately applied, such as the remote education through radio. And also we need to support the capacity building of remote education using ICT devices as well as infrastructure for remote education. And next, we need to build the capacity of local manpower. In order to enable remote measurement and evaluation of a cooperation project, we need to increase the manpower or the capabilities of local people. And also, we need to develop training programs in various methods and contents for local teachers and officers. Next, we need to diversify development cooperation. We need to enhance our partnerships with international organizations and NGOs. Furthermore, we need to expand the participation of private companies in education development cooperation. Next, we need to strengthen our partnership with the CSOs. Because the CSOs have better access to the vulnerable groups. So by enhancing our partnership with CSO, we can have a better means to provide better support to the vulnerable groups. And also, if the participation of the private sector players increases, then actually we can increase the budget. And that's why we need to diversify the participation of different actors in development cooperation. Last but not least, we need to develop a new ODA model. We need to develop an innovative model linking other foreign and domestic policies. And also we can develop the model by restructuring existing ODA projects. Last but not least, we can we need to create a tripartite cooperation model to provide support in connection with the key countries and organizations in the region. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Director Ahn. Director Ahn briefed us on a multi-year research project conducted by KEDI and also gave a very valuable information about what's going on site in developing countries. She also emphasized the importance of multilateral partnership to further promote effectiveness of the cooperation education cooperation projects.
Now let me invite the last presenter, Seo Dong-won, who will be delivering a presentation on harnessing ICT for education development. Mr. Seo Dong-won is the Director of the Office of Strategy Planning, Korea Education and Research Information Service. I think I will stay in line with the topic that has been covered so far. The global pandemic has brought about a lot of confusion in the educational ODA sector. Before COVID, developing countries were faced with many issues regarding technology and ICT, but we felt that we would be able to resolve them. But confusion continues. In the past 20 and 30 years, international community has been making a lot of efforts. And the theme of this session is the next steps for Korea's educational ODA. And I would like to talk about what we should focus on when it comes to employing ICT in our educational ODA. 30 years ago, in a small city in Thailand, the Jomtien Declaration was announced, and it was turned into the Dakar Framework for Action in 2000. And during this process, ICT took a center stage. It was seen as a way to expand opportunities for education and also the quality of education. And many of the reports published at the time mentioned this, and it was seen as a way to overcome the digital divide and digital gap. In 2015, the Incheon Declaration was announced, and the Qingdao Declaration was also announced, and specific targets and goals related to ICT was derived. ICT is a strategy and mechanism for lifelong learning. In particular, it received a lot of spotlight in non-formal education. So open courses such as MOOC was seen as a possibility to enhance the potential of developing countries. It was also linked to the human rights of women and the right to education for women. So it was seen as a way to provide inclusive education, and in particular, mobile education received a lot of attention. In order to apply the ICT to schools, the competency of teachers are important, and this fact started to be highlighted in 2015. And ICT training for pre-service and in-service teachers was highlighted at this point. And UNESCO led the discourse on ICT in education, and it came up with enhancing 21st century competencies, and it also talked about the pedagogical innovation that would be needed. And at the center of this is teacher competency, and therefore teacher capacity building and distance learning was highlighted. But looking back, there are some points we need to reconsider. If you look at the UNESCO report published this year, this is what it says. 100 million more children fail basic reading skills due to COVID-19, and the pandemic has disrupted schooling for an average of 25 weeks. And 65% of low-income countries have reduced educational funding. And this is leading to a generational catastrophe. So this is leading to trauma of an entire generation. Furthermore, if you look at a report published by the World Bank this year, the report states that 90% of 10-year-olds in remote classes cannot read. So vulnerable children cannot read, and distance education system was not properly provided in most countries. And even in European countries, there are not many cases where real-time interactive classes were provided. Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, Zooms. These commercial platforms were used in some countries, but their use was limited. And as a result, since last year, we need to take stock of Pakistan's telescope project or Sierra Leone's radio-based project. And If you look at these cases, they remind us of the analog-based remote learning that was mentioned 30 years ago, and this could raise some concerns. And in this process, in the pandemic, amid the pandemic, there are some policies and measures that we should take notice of. A lot of people are sick of Zoom. I also attend a lot of Zoom meetings, and I find it excruciating actually to take part in these Zoom meetings. In India, using appropriate technology, have come up with a game-based learning program. It's kind of like Minecraft, but it's a farm craft. So students learn how to grow crop in cyberspace. And this program, MindSpark, has been very successful. And although it is not directly related to ICT, the UK government has come up with a new initiative, the Turing Scheme initiative. This initiative was born out of a concern of the UK government that their students will lose competency after Brexit. In Europe, all students can take advantage of Erasmus system. And so UK students will not be able to take advantage of the Erasmus system. And that is why they came up with this Turing scheme. And this is something that is noteworthy. When we think about ICT in education, we think about the ICT as a delivery mechanism, but recently ICT itself is considered a subject to be learned. In November last year, the Korean government also announced the general discussion for the curriculum revision, and it aims to deal with digital literacy and media literacy. So in the past, Korea focused on software and coding education, but now that has changed, and the Korean government is focusing on artificial intelligence. And in developing countries, there is a demand to foster talent in these new sectors. And I believe that this is where we can find a great potential for future educational ODA. With our partner countries, we will be able to grow together. So fostering talent in Korea is important, but also collaborating with recipient countries could prove to be an opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier, UNESCO and the World Bank place great importance on OER, open education resources. Because this is a free educational content, we need to think about how we can localize this and how we can form a repository in which Korean students can take advantage of and recipient country students can take advantage of as well. I have a few cases from some developed countries. In Germany, they came up with a smart learning application, LMS. And recently, they have combined video gaming and learning, and they have come up with a Twitch-like platform, which is an online gamification platform. And they have also come up with a new social learning platform. And through these social learning platforms, we are providing in Korea a method to learn different social skills. And recently, we have seen the emergence of Open STEM Labs programs. technology is no longer seen simply as an educational delivery mechanism. Rather, this takes advantage of VR and metaverse, very popular concepts, and science labs, contextual labs are built in a virtual reality. And this means that without the physical infrastructure, developing countries can take advantage of these so-called facilities. The last example is the European School Net. This is a Education Minister Council of Europe, if you will. They have a project called e-twinning, and this was started 15 years ago. So a school in rural Finland and a school in another country can meet monthly on the cyber platform and or even weekly. And this promotes cultural understanding and learning of different countries and cultures. And Korea has had similar programs as well. The city of Busan and a city in Australia have also engaged in a similar project to enhance understanding of each other's countries and cultures to enhance global citizenry. Now, because I do not have a lot of time, I'm going to highlight some of the educational ODA policy efforts that have been made, especially in the ICT sector by the Korean government. We have different bilateral programs carried out by KWAK and recently through EDCF. We are providing support for recipient countries to make policy decisions using EMIS system. CARIS also is pursuing different international cooperation initiatives. The different initiatives makes use of learning platforms and learning management systems and other R&D systems. And we are providing these systems and initiatives to the recipient countries. Next year, we will carry out a project with Colombia, and the Colombia government asked that we come up with a way to support them to build a policy roadmap to foster ICT talent in their country. So as you can see, the scope of the projects are very broad. I would now like to go over simply the major achievements of these projects. First of all, these efforts have improved learning environments in developing countries in integrating digital technology. And schools were transformed as the heart of the community. Many developing countries, the parents do not want children to go to school. They would rather their children engage in economic activity. However, with the school being more interesting, and the school teaching children how to use digital tools, students feel that school is more fun and interesting. In a previous session, we talked. There was a question about the efficacy of digital learning. From my personal experience, I would like to say that we cannot determine this from a cognitive perspective. I do not think that that is very meaningful. What is more meaningful is to look at the affective domain. When this technology is used, schools can change, and the perception of schools by the children can change, and the children can think of their children differently. They can think of their friends differently, and this can perhaps motivate them differently. And it can also impact their perception regarding the world. And this is something that we need to continue to look into. Lastly, I would like to make some policy recommendations. In developing countries, for organic growth, we need more long-term or mid to long-term projects, and this was echoed by some of my fellow speakers. Currently, agencies, institutions really have a lot of demand for institutional development, as mentioned in the previous session. For instance, nursing schools need a program or way to foster more nurses, or a developing country would like to foster more teachers. So instead of receiving a program or hardware, they want to support in establishing their own system and policy roadmap to achieve that goal. And as I mentioned earlier, developing countries have a demand to foster talent in the so-called new industries, and I think Korea has a lot of competitiveness in the private, in academia, and also in industry. For instance, I think that we can provide educational ODA and collaboration based on our strength. And as I mentioned earlier, through virtual reality, we can build a science laboratory acts, and we can also provide and distribute more contents through open educational resources, or OER. And in terms of policy, Korea provides a lot of funds to international agencies, and I think that universities and other agencies can take part in projects that can utilize these funds. And personally, what I believe is very meaningful is we need to foster experts at home that can become experts in educational ODA. So we can train and induce the participation of university students who are interested. And we can give them opportunities to take part in real projects. If you look back in the past 4 years, one of the biggest achievements is that many of the university students who got this experience moved on to international agencies or other NGOs or other civic organizations. They actually got employed. And so at the end of the day, their participation or them moving on to becoming experts will actually build a stronger ecosystem. And many youth in the US actually have built startups that provide educational ODA. And I think that we need more support for youth who are interested in educational ODA. So in order to deal with and prepare for COVID-19, of course, we will all need to collaborate. But as I mentioned earlier, our institutions, our universities, and the private sector and the civic center must come together to build a stronger foundation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Seo. He talked about ICT and educational ODA, and he talked about how ICT can be an enabler for educational ODA, and he gave us a lot of cases, and he talked about what lessons we need to learn from each of these cases. Thank you for your presentation.
Now let us have a Q&A session. A few days ago, I visited UN website, and there was a report saying that the COVID-19 actually wiped out the 20 years of educational gains that the international community has gained. So for the past 20 years, we have made various efforts in the sector of education, but now we are going back to the place where we were like 20 years ago. So actually, we need to go back to the day when we actually launched the Millennium Development Goals like 20 years ago. So it's a serious situation. And also, we think about how we can improve resilience and the resilience-related education. And it seems there are a lot of people who take interest in such topics. We have questions from the participants. Please listen to the questions and think about your answers. We have a question from Kim Sun-mi, and her question is directed to Professor Park. as a part of our cooperation to reduce the digital education gap, what kind of things can be done in the form of ODA? And the second question is asked by a participant called Jin-Eun, and her question is directed to Director Seok. So what could be the specific targets and areas and implementation methodology with regard to the ICT ODA education? And there is another question asked by a participant, Yang Chang-yeol, and his question is directed to both Professor Park and Director Seok. So I know that neither of you are from the Ministry of Education, but his question is, what would be the key role of a Ministry of Education in education ODA? Is it necessary to arrange a meeting among the participants of ODA education product? And another question is directed to Director Yang. Actually, as a KWAK director, you have engaged yourself in various ODA projects in developing countries. And in your conclusion, you just mentioned the importance of a partnership with private sector actors. So actually, we need to work with CSOs and NGOs and international organizations to have a better impact or outcome of the ODA project. We all know that a partnership can bring about great result and outcomes. So the partnership should be the ultimate goal, not only the means of our project implementation. But it's very difficult to maintain partnership, particularly in developing countries. Once the project is over, then actually it's very difficult to maintain or have a continued impact of the project in developing countries. So in terms of a partnership, what would be the ways to further strengthen and maintain partnership in the field of education ODA? And Professor Park, could you please answer first?
Thank you very much. I think I received two questions. The first question was, what can ODA do to reduce the digital education gap? I think that Mr. Seok is an expert and he is more qualified to answer that question. But what I can say is that I think that we can improve the educational infrastructure. I think that this is an urgent project. I think that this is what ODA can deal with. But I think that aside from infrastructure, there are many other elements to be considered. First, it pertains to digital literacy, as mentioned by Mr. Seok, and he actually emphasized this. When we talk about the digital divide, we're not simply talking about the digital infrastructure divide. We also need to resolve the gap in digital literacy. So there would be many opportunities for co-opportunities in that area. And we could also cooperate to utilize ICT to enhance digital accessibility. In Korea, we are also grappling with what we can do after building infrastructure and after providing contents in terms of educational delivery. So the way you deliver a course using ICT is different, perhaps with the analog way. So this is something that we need to contemplate as well. So in the past, we're used to going to a class and listening to a lecture for 40 to 50 minutes. But in digital education, we have to think about whether 40 to 50 minutes is the same 40 to 50 minutes online. So no country has actually experienced this. So I think that educational ODA can play a part in facilitating this sort of cooperation. And to answer your second question, I think the education ministry is in the best position to integrate the different resources. So even if we have an ODA agency, their experience and their network will be different from that of the education ministry. As I mentioned earlier, the education ministry can accumulate the resources in Korea and facilitate the utilization of these resources. And the education can become a platform for communication for different actors that can play a part in educational ODA. Mr. Seo, with regards to ICT ODA projects, I think there are several that I would like to introduce. First, this project is now complete, as I understand. We had a project, the Solar School project, which was carried out in 12 African countries. So what happened there was we transformed containers into science labs or digital labs. So the Solar Schools was funded by Samsung Electronics, and the Korean Education Ministry and CARIS provided training to enhance the capacity of teachers, and we also provided contents that can be used in the solar classroom. And the second project, which I'm especially proud of, it was carried out in Uzbekistan. We carried out e-learning consulting project, and Uzbekistan wanted to draw up a policy roadmap, and we assisted in this. And what they wanted was enhancing the teacher capacity in ICT, and they wanted to develop a module, and this brought together international agencies and Korean partners. So there was a bilateral cooperation. But the beginning of this project was the education minister. The UNESCO Bangkok office carried out a basic research on basic competencies of teachers with Korean funding, but this report was not localized in the Uzbekistan context. And so the Uzbekistan government made a request. So we carried out a project in which we carried out a teacher training module and also a policy roadmap for Uzbekistan, which is applied nationwide. And we also fostered leading teachers in software education in 2019 in Paraguay, and also we carried out this project in Vietnam as well. And I would like to answer the second question as well. I completely agree with Professor Bach. I think the Education Ministry has the power to bring together people and utilize its network. Also, it has to recognize that there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of teachers to take part in educational ODA. Once they build their experience and once they get knowledge, teachers can relay this to children. And so I think that this is where the power of the Education Ministry lies. And in the Leading Universities project and other globalization projects, there are many achievements and outcomes that are coming out. And the Education Minister will be in the best position to handle and manage these outcomes.
Director On? Yes, you asked a question about partnership. Basically, when it comes to the education sector and the Ministry of Education project in particular, many civil organizations mentioned that it's very difficult for them to cooperate with the Ministry of Education, and also there are very few projects that they can carry out with the Ministry of Education. It's because there's very little overlapping in the areas between the civil organizations, projects, and the projects engaged by the Ministry of Education. And also, Ministry of Education focuses on teacher or the school focused projects. So it's very difficult to find a connection with the Ministry of Education in terms of KWAK projects. But one of the biggest difficulties that KWAK is faced with is the administrative the procedures. So it's okay for us to proceed the on-site or the field projects, but we actually need to carry out a lot of paperwork or the administrative the procedures to implement our projects. This year and last year, I conducted research, actually surveying the step members in the civil organizations, and actually most frequently answered the point was that they would like to have a streamlined administrative procedures for better the implementation of their cooperation projects. As I mentioned before, there is a great difficulty in terms of implementing or carrying out administrative procedures. It's very difficult to find relevant funding, and that's why a lot of the civil organizations try to find sponsors in the private business sector rather than going to the public organizations. And if you take a look at the 5-year plan for the Ministry of Education, there is a point which is emphasizes the partnership with the civil society. So I believe that there is some improvement to be made in terms of ODA implementation, particularly the partnership between the government agencies and the civil societies. And also, when it comes to the partnership with the private businesses, I believe that such partnership is very important, particularly in terms of higher education project or the TVET project. The idealistic outcome of such project would be enable the students to get job in private business sector. So from the implementation stage, we need to engage the private businesses in the higher education projects or the TVET projects. I have had a chance to visit developing countries while conducting research in this specific area. And the biggest demand in the developing countries in terms of education ODA is the cooperation between academia and industry. And also, they wanted to learn from Korea, particularly in terms of boosting the partnership between academia and industry. And as a part of our support for developing countries, the Ministry of Education launched a higher education support program targeting developing countries. And I believe that the Ministry of Education needs to involve in the planning stage of higher education or TVET education support project and engage the private businesses in the design of a support program. And that should be the future direction for higher education cooperation project. Actually, I just happen to have a lot of discussions with the business sector people, particularly in the field of ESG. And actually, they have a lot of difficulties in identifying or discovering relevant new business models in the sector of the ESG. And they actually want to cooperate with the civil organizations. And also, we expect that there will be an increasing demand for humanitarian aid after the COVID-19 pandemic era.
I have some questions, final questions for Mr. Park. In your presentation, you talked about the local and provincial education offices. Are there any projects that they can be effective partners in? So if you can just throw out some ideas. And to Ms. An, you carried out a lot of interviews. There are many challenges related to COVID, but I think there are a lot of opportunities as well. For myself, I can actually take part in 2 international conferences a day, so I have become more efficient. So there are many changes and challenges from COVID, but there are opportunities. So which opportunities do we really need to take advantage of at this point? And to Mr. Seo, this is the last question. I am actually engaged in ICT education for e-government. So we are providing this education to Asian public officials. I've always been curious when it comes to ICT in higher education. Sometimes it can yield unintended results. For instance, in higher education, for instance, if we give out diplomas, the students who receive the diplomas actually move abroad with that diploma. So what we were trying to do was we were fostering the higher education in that country, but it leads to basically all their talent leaving the country. So the problem is that the people who receive this education do not stay in their country, and sometimes they are not effective in communicating what they've learned to other generations in their country. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this problem, Mr. Park. You were talking about the cooperation with local and provincial educational offices. If you look at the projects so far, most of the focus has been on teacher exchange based on ICT projects. In the initial stages, we focused on delivering the programs that we have. But I think that now they have more capacity. They have a lot of resources at schools with teachers, and so they can be able to actually build a curriculum, and they will be able to collaborate with the schools in developing countries and co-develop a curriculum. So they can also exchange different classes, student exchanges, and they can exchange in many more sectors than they have done so far.
You just asked a question about where the COVID-19 and the crisis has turned into an opportunity. While you're working on the cooperation projects, we just came up with the sustainability issue, particularly the education cooperation project. While the project is engaged and carried out, and the actual sponsors take care of all the works. And once the project is complete, then the sponsor, the agencies or the staff members leave the target country or the partner country, and the project is not viable anymore in that partner country. That happened a lot. That's why we need to improve the capacity of the local experts or local staff members. Because the lack of local members or the local staff's capability lead to the failure of the past project. So in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we just came to realize the absolute need of the improvement of the staff members in the local fields. And I believe that actually there are a lot of efforts being made to increase the capacity of local staff members, and that is a quite positive signal, I guess.
In early 2000, the Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat were very popular books authored by Thomas Friedman. At the time, it was mentioned in this book about the issues related to brain drain, and I think that a lot of time has passed, and since we haven't been able to overcome these issues, I will not say which country, but there was one partner country, and we provided ICT capacity training for teachers of that country over a period of several years. After several years, when we went there to visit them, many of the teachers actually got new jobs in many countries around the world. The teacher salary is not that large. It's around 100,000 won in Korean won. And when they actually get a job at a bank, they can get paid double or triple of what they earn as teachers. And there's really nothing we can do on the field, but we need to be able to design the policies so that we can prevent this from happening. I think that this is something that we will continue to grapple with, as you mentioned, Professor. When it comes to ICT, sometimes it is a capacity that is generally very difficult to learn in the developing countries. And so there is a movement to better paying jobs or to other countries. I agree with you that this is an issue and a problem, but I really don't have the solution as to how we can solve that. I think that that is up to the domestic policies of the recipient country. They have to come up with policies to prevent this from happening. Thank you very much. ODA needs to be provided in the mid to long term with a strategy that is mid to long term as well. And I think the exchanges also need to have a mid to long term view so that we can think about many unpredictable events. And we also need to think about the sustainability of the cooperation as well. I would like to thank our presenters for sharing their experience and the outcomes of their results. I would like to thank our participants online. Thank you very much.
네. 이렇게 해서 오늘 모든 세션이 끝났습니다.
This concludes today's sessions. I would like to thank the speakers for their excellent presentations and discussions. And also, above all, I would like to thank the audience who have actually participated so far. To those who pre-registered, a link to the survey will be sent via text message or email. We'll give out prizes through a lucky draw to those who participate. Through the two-day discussion, we have reaffirmed that we are facing a difficult journey toward the implementation of SDG4 and educational recovery. And we also reaffirmed that we need to find the relevant the future direction together with governments, experts, and civil societies. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my gratitude to everyone who joined us for 2 days on this journey. We would like to ask for your interest and support in our efforts to implement SDG4 and restore education in the future. This concludes the 2021 International Education Forum. Thank you very much.